On March the 10th, 2012, an Italian oil tanker ran aground on a rocky cliff in Sicily, just off the coast of one of the world's most cherished cities, Syracuse. The captain had lost control of the vessel during a massive storm, forcing him to abandon ship as it crashed against the rocks. The accident triggered one of Italy's most dramatic and dangerous helicopter rescues to save the 19 crew on board. A year and a half later, Dutch and Italian Salvage Masters came to the rescue to cut up the wreck and take it away for scrap in order to restore this beautiful stretch of Mediterranean coastline. A severe storm in March 2012 surprised many a ship in the Mediterranean. But one vessel in particular would be caught in its grip and end up beached on the perilous cliffs of Sicily for over a year.
We are talking about a gale force between 8 and 9, with waves around 10 meters high and winds of around 64 to 68 knots. So these were really difficult conditions, a very severe storm.
As the ship rammed up against the sharp rocks, rescuing the crew pushed Coast Guard helicopter pilot skills to the limit. When the storm subsided, there was no option but to call in an international team of Dutch and Italian salvers.
The whole operation is directed by a salvage master. However, it is a team effort, a question of planning.
First, when we got that call, what I do is I try to get as much information as possible. Otherwise, I just get my gear and I come here to the warehouse, pick up my stuff, and I go to the airport.
So close to the city limits of this prime tourist destination, it was critical that the sad sight of the wreck disappear from view. Over the months, the steel carcass was literally cut up, then hauled away to be broken into the smallest pieces of scrap iron.
The structure was, let's say, to coin a phrase, attacked. It was a bit like lions attacking their prey.
Syracuse. 2,500 years ago, this fortress city rivaled Athens and Sparta in power and wealth. It is located on the southeastern tip of the Mediterranean's largest island, Sicily, and today is one of UNESCO's World Heritage Sites.
Syracuse is a city where even today people come to study our history and our archaeological sites. We have the largest Greek theatre in the world. Among other things, Syracuse also has some protected marine areas, so environmental issues are felt acutely here.
But there is another side of this part of Sicily that tourists rarely see. The area just north of Syracuse is the Priolo Gargallo petrochemical complex, one of the largest of its kind in Europe. It is also one of Italy's most polluted sites, on the national list of environmental cleanup priorities. The discovery of petroleum in the 1950s triggered an economic boom in Sicily, with refineries and petrochemical plants of some of the world's energy giants springing up all along the coast. Pipelines stretch out into the sea for tankers to fill up. Enzo Parisi leads an environmental watchdog group that keeps an eye on ship traffic and campaigns for cleaning up hundreds of tons of toxic waste left behind by the chemical plants and oil companies operating here.
Sicily refines half the oil needed for all of Italy. We have approximately 50 million tons passing through here.
On the morning of March the 10th, 2012, an oil tanker belonging to Rome-based oil transport company Augusta II was returning from having taken a load of crude oil to Porto Marghera, near Venice. The company transports 7 million tons of oil and gas products annually, chartered to some of the biggest multinational energy groups in the world. It was returning to here in Augusta, just north of Syracuse, where it would then load another shipment.
There are important refineries here. There's Lukoil, Isab, Erg, to name but a few. Agip was here. Eni is here. They refine the petroleum, process it, and then transport it to the north of Italy by way of these oil tankers.
But that day, a nasty storm was brewing in the Ionian Sea. High winds and rain lashed the coast and whipped up huge waves. A storm of such magnitude hadn't been seen in eastern Sicily in decades.
This ship left Porto Marghera on the 8th of March after delivering a cargo of refined crude oil. On its way back, it sailed into a storm that had already been announced in the weather bulletin, and according to the magistrates, the captain hadn't paid enough attention, had underestimated the importance of this forecast of bad weather, which was already awful.
Port authorities were struggling to take care of the ships already seeking safety in their ports, and warned the tanker to head back out to safer waters.
A situation like this, as the fishermen confirm, had never been seen before. The waves were so high and so massive that they crashed over both quaysides protecting the bay. It was weather that hadn't been seen here in the last 50 or 60 years.
As soon as they arrived near the port of Augusta, the control tower on the mainland advised them not to come into port because it wasn't possible. One, because there were already 30 ships sheltering inside the protected area of the port. Two, because it would have been impossible, because the sea was just far too rough.
The captain, however, motored on, convinced he could weather the storm and get into port.
Despite that they had been advised both by the Coast Guard of Augusta as well as the pilots at Augusta, the ship's crew pushed on with the navigation in the belief that they could make it.
As the captain tried in vain to regain control of his vessel, the storm worsened and the jagged volcanic cliffs drew closer.
There was a real storm in progress, the likes of which had never been seen before. As many as 32 times, the captain had tried to restart the engine and get going, but the propellers kept coming up out of the water, then jamming, and in the end, the ship was blown completely off course.
With the ship empty of cargo and the rough seas, the rudder became useless and the ship was unable to navigate.
The boat drifted and completely smashed against the rocks. The Mayday was sent out at the last minute, so we had to come to the rescue with our helicopters, which were the only ones at this point that could attempt a sea rescue of the crew on board the ship.
2 helicopters were scrambled from the Catania Air Base, an AB-412 and a brand new AW-139. Pilots arriving could see the crew, all wearing life jackets, gathered on the ship's stern for rescue, as waves and 110 km/h winds swept the vessel. Helicopter pilots first tried to lower a rescue man down onto the ship, but weather conditions made it too dangerous, and the plan was scrapped. Each mariner would have to hook himself into a harness to be pulled to safety as the ship rocked from side to side. Pilots kept losing visual contact. The rescue was proving extremely dangerous.
All 19 were saved by the Coast Guard helicopters that, in hovering, that is, by staying right above the ship, were able to lower a harness using a winch and then one by one lift all 19 men into the helicopters. The last one up, of course, was the captain.
On land, tension was rising. 2 hours later, all 19 members of the crew had been brought to safety. It was one of the Mediterranean's most spectacular and dangerous sea-to-air rescues of modern times. The shaken sailors were transported into Syracuse for medical treatment.
They were, of course, cold and afraid. They were hungry, exhausted. The situation was really dramatic.
But the oil tanker was now firmly stuck and would stay that way for over a year as officials waded through the massive bureaucracy. This was an environmentally sensitive site and also a protected marine reserve near a UNESCO World Heritage City. It would take months of negotiations before the wreck could be safely salvaged. In March 2012, an oil tanker returning to Sicily after delivering crude oil to a port near Venice crashed into the coast while navigating through a massive storm. 19 crew members were brought to safety in one of the Coast Guard's most impressive sea-to-air rescues ever. But while all the sailors were saved, the tanker itself could not be repaired. It lay disabled just meters from the outskirts of the Sicilian city of Syracuse.
The gash was enormous because the bow and the central part of the ship were completely destroyed, and this meant that right from the start, it was clear that it would have to be cut, then scrapped.
On the other side of Europe, the salvage company Smit Salvage received a call to assess what could be done. Managers gathered in their Rotterdam shipyard headquarters to discuss an immediate response.
Within a day it was smashed to pieces. Not to pieces, but anyhow the complete bottom ripped out. First indication, no refloating possible, so other things need to be performed.
Just 2 months before, Keyes and his Smit Salvage Masters had been on another high-profile shipwreck along a beautiful Italian coastline, the Costa Concordia, which capsized off the port of Giglio in Tuscany. 32 lives were lost in that disaster, and the ship was left beached near the port for more than 2 years as the world's top salvage masters struggled to right it, refloat it, and tow it away. When the tanker ran aground near Syracuse, immediately there were comparisons and concerns that the shipwreck might draw similar negative attention.
Of course, it attracted attention because just 2 months before there'd been the much more important, more serious incident of the Costa Crociere. So people thought that this was the repetition in miniature of the tragedy that had struck the island of Giglio.
That's why the authorities took so long with the negotiations to have it removed, because they wanted to be sure that everything happened according to the book, because they were very afraid of the media, of the attention this might get.
The tanker that ran aground off Syracuse had been built recently, in 2007, in the Tuzla shipyards in Turkey. That made it appealing to looters, so city officials sealed off the area to prevent anyone from climbing on board.
The ship was brand new, so it was very appealing. We decided to cordon off the area in such a way that also from the land nobody could get close to it. We arranged a continuous patrol by a private security firm who was there 24 hours a day, and we put up floodlights to illuminate the area during the night to avoid any kind of problem.
The stranded ship quickly became a spectacle for local residents, who rode out on the bike trail to marvel at the troubled vessel, with a 14-meter gash in its side, listing 40 degrees, and groaning against the rocks.
Everything was in full view of everyone, of the people who lived in the area, who were always looking out at it, but also those who walked, cycled, jogged around there. So every day we were dealing with the public, mainly with those who lived there, but not just them, because the only bicycle path we have just happens to be right there.
Once the site was protected, officials began monitoring the immediate environmental danger. Though the tanker had been empty when it was wrecked, the reserve tanks held nearly 25,000 cubic meters of oil, gas, and fuel. Large floating barriers were laid to prevent any fuel spills. Technicians reviewed the ship and determined it was damaged in holds 1, 2, and 6. All of the holds and the machine room were flooded. It was clear that the ship could not be refloated. Bids went out for who would carry out the salvage. The contract was eventually won by the team from Smit Salvage, one of the world's biggest salvage companies. Smit has taken on some of the most complex salvages worldwide. They save burning ships, retrieve dangerous cargoes, and raise some of the biggest vessels on the seas today. Jules Martina has been around the world on salvages, but it was his first trip to Sicily. What he found on site led him to believe the only option available was to cut the tanker into pieces and demolish it.
All the tanks were ruptured, and the bottom side of the vessel was severely damaged, so there was no way we could have refloated it. And that's the reason why we decided that the best solution is to cut the vessel in pieces and remove it away. So it was severely damaged.
We were dealing with a chemical transport ship that had become lodged on the rocks of Syracuse. The plan was to cut the ship into 7 pieces plus the superstructure.
Everywhere they go around the world, Smit always partner with local companies. In Italy, while working on the Costa Concordia, they formed a close bond with a family of historical salvage masters from Tuscany, Neri Salvage. It seemed only natural for them to work on this salvage in Sicily together as well.
They provided the vessels that we used and the sea legs, the tugboats and the sea legs, and we provided the rest of the equipment like divers and diving equipment, the chains, the slings, the bollards, all that sort of equipment that we did, and they did the vessels.
These tugs in particular, but also other crafts in our fleet, are classified for salvage, which means that on board they have specific equipment like depletion pumps, water extraction pumps, and so on, to provide emergency assistance to ships in need or in difficulty.
The close-knit family of Tuscan salvage masters Neri Salvage have been perfecting the art of shipbuilding and recovery since the 1800s, here in the port of Livorno. Corrado Neri is the 5th generation of his family to work in the salvage sector. His ancestors were known as among the best shipbuilders and salvers in Italy. Piero Neri is the one tasked with now handing his job down to the next generation.
My great-grandfather, Costante, was the one who made the big step forward. He started to build the first big wooden boats, and so these wooden boats drew close to the ships, and they were able to take the cargo and offload in the canals of the port of Livorno. My great-grandfather's stroke of genius was to concentrate on one particular sector of marine services, in fact, the riskiest, but also the one with the highest profit potential.
The Neri family was able to raise ships that other experts had written off as lost forever.
In 1924, he carried out a major salvage operation on a Dutch ship, Kursk, which had sunk outside the port of Bastia. And in contrast with the opinion of the Lloyd's experts of the time, who believed the ship could not be salvaged, we managed to salvage both the ship and its cargo.
By 1924, Piero's grandfather, Tito, had built such a reputation that the family was sought out by Hollywood giant Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer to help stage epic sea battle scenes for the first silent film of Ben-Hur. Neri Salvage struck a deal with MGM to build all the ships, find all the extras, and coordinate the scenes. It was a deal that would go down in family history.
Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer came to Livorno, contacted my grandfather, and wanted to reach an agreement with him. They asked Tito, "What kind of contract do you want?" And my grandpa said, "Exactly the same kind of contract you usually sign in the United States." My grandfather had never studied. He knew just a couple of words of English, but he managed to get himself a contract in which all his expenses were reimbursed, plus 20% of the film's box office takings, and he started to earn a fortune.
But World War II would nearly destroy the family of courageous Italian salvage masters. Knowing the port of Livorno would be bombed, which it was by both German and Allied forces, Tito Neri made an unthinkable calculation. He would sink his fleet to save it.
My grandfather had suffered the requisitioning of a few of his ships and tugs. He decided to sink all the ones he had left, so he could bring them to the surface again once the storm had passed. So that's exactly what he did. He sunk them all in the port of Livorno, and afterwards he brought them up again, and he had his fleet once more.
With most of the fleet salvaged, after the war the intrepid family was in business once again. With its historic reputation and contacts throughout Italy, Neri immediately found local partners to help the salvage and demolition in Sicily. They formed a consortium to work hand in hand with Smit Salvage Masters. But in the months ahead, this international team of experts would face some serious challenges. A large oil tanker had run aground on the island of Sicily in March 2012. 19 members of the crew had barely escaped with their lives, but the tanker remained stranded on the perilous coast near Syracuse. Quickly, contracts were secured to protect the ship, clean up the fuel, and salvage the damaged tanker. The unpredictable spring weather made the fuels sitting in the stranded oil tanker a danger to the local environment. Floating barriers were installed around the ship to contain any possible spills. Coast Guard divers verified all the conditions underwater. Oil skimming machines and other equipment were put on standby in case the pump failed or the hose ruptured during the fuel transfer, causing an oil spill. Neri's tugs are specially equipped to handle any disaster at sea.
funzione principale dei rimorchiatori è quella di traino.
The tug's principal functions are pulling and to prevent fire and pollution. They supply depletion pumps, which are pumps that are attached to the stranded ship and pump out the water, allowing the ship to float once more. Our fleet has more than 30 vessels, which range from 3,000 horsepower up to 10,000.
Fino a 10.000 cavalli di potenza.
The plan for removing the wrecked oil tanker from the Syracuse coastline seemed fairly simple on paper. After being cut into sections, it would be lifted away and recycled. The salvage would use a technique called chain cutting, a process that uses a cable, sometimes coated with diamonds or other abrasive material, to slice the vessel into pieces.
It works like a saw. You pull the chain through from one side, for example, from port side to starboard, and you hang it into the blocks of the sheet legs, and then you start moving the blocks up and down, and and you run the chain through the metal of the ship, and it cuts it right through.
The part of the ship that was outside the water would be cut with large chains attached to this crane barge or shear leg, the biggest of its kind in the Mediterranean, and able to pull 1,000 tons. It would use its massive leverage to move the chain back and forth through the double-hulled ship. Underwater, divers would make hot cuts.
Equipment that we needed was a crane barge and a shear legs to pull chains underneath the vessel, and also we needed divers to do some cutting on the water, because normally what we do when we are going to lift a wreck, we try to pull slings and chains under the wreck, but because this wreck was sitting hard on the rocks, it was impossible to get the chains underneath, so we had to do some cutting with divers.
There is a preliminary job on the part of the divers. They have to identify the way in which the lifting cables should be applied before the sections can be raised. Those red blocks, or jiggers that you see behind me, can each lift 500 tons. From there, the steel cables are run, which will raise the sections of the ship.
But local environmental agencies and activists had been following the plans for the salvage with concern.
Syracuse, the Bay of Santa Panagia, but also the marine reserves of Capomuro di Porco, are a treasure trove of biodiversity. To put all this biodiversity at risk wouldn't just be harming Syracuse and its historic natural and cultural heritage, but it would also damage the biodiversity of the entire Mediterranean.
An investigation was launched into the original cause of the wreck. The black box was opened to get to the bottom of the incident.
According to the investigation carried out by the Syracuse magistrates, and with the evidence taken from the black box, they were able to reconstruct events and attribute responsibility exclusively to the captain.
However, the accident could have been much worse. Just a few hundred meters away were several docks for loading and unloading oil products, which the tanker only narrowly missed. A collision would have spelled disaster.
An oil leak in the area where the Magna Grecia was born. The cliffs, the city, the beaches, the nature trails, the marine reserves. We would not only have caused an environmental disaster, but would also have wiped out, or at least put at risk, a cultural and historical heritage which is one of the most important in the world.
Local environmental groups were already nervous, and now it was clear that the salvage would generate both noise and debris. The wreck was lying just meters away from the densely populated quarter of Mazzarona. Residents there were starting to have concerns about the plan to cut the ship into pieces, that fragments might be deposited on the seabed. Authorities cordoned off an 800-meter area surrounding the ship where locals were accustomed to fishing for tuna and relaxing along the panoramic coastline. Others worried the chain cutting might be noisy.
Abbiamo avuto a che fare anche con la parte relativa alla tutela dei rumori, perché
We also have to address the noise, because we are near the coast where people visit, near apartments, so we have to protect the environment, not just from water pollution or air pollution through dust particles, but even noise pollution.
addirittura anche dell'inquinamento acustico.
La parte ambientale e di studio preliminare, sebbene sia possibile farla,
The environmental part, and all the preliminary studies, as much as it is possible to do, is an urgent concern for the authorities. So salvage companies have to dedicate a lot of attention to environmental monitoring of the marine seabed to return the site to its pristine environmental condition.
Once the necessary environmental precautions had been taken, it took Augustea and Smit workers a month and a half to pump out the fuel from the ship's engines.
We have several equipment that we use, like we have the hot tap that we use for removing oil out of the tanks. We have some sort of a heating system that we use to heat the oil up if it's very, very cold and the density is very thick that you cannot get it out. So we got different systems that we use to remove the oil out.
After the oil had been removed, preparations could begin for the cutting stage.
You have to make sure that even though the vessel was empty, that all the lines and the tanks are empty. And you have to make sure that you have walkways and platforms and stuff, because the vessel was at a 30-degree angle. And we had to make the working area safe for the people to work there. So all these preparations take some time. It's not just to go there and do the cut and that's it.
More than a year later, under the heat of the Sicilian sun in June of 2013, preparations were complete and it was time to salvage the tanker. Materials arrived to begin the delicate task. It would also have to be stripped of its recyclable parts. Every object, including the crew's quarters, would be taken out and reused if possible.
90% of the ship is metal, so everything that was recycled was analyzed. All the pieces that arrived here were analyzed in accordance with the environmental regulations of the state and regional agencies.
The salvage plan called for each section to be chain cut, then lifted carefully out of the sea onto a waiting barge, then transferred to a large floating dock in the Baia di Santa Panagia. Before it could be scrapped, however, engineers had to study the way the vessel was built to determine where best to make the cuts.
Once we had individualized where to do the cuts, we proceeded to do the actual cutting, initially with the chain in the exposed parts. Remember that the ship was leaning to the left and mainly out of the water, and so the exposed parts were cut using heat cutters and the submerged part using chains.
But performing a salvage so near the jagged cliffs would be a major challenge.
The ship was located very close to the cliffs, so we came about 20 meters from the ship. But the problem was the undertow around the vessel and against the cliff, which moved the pontoon in sudden and unexpected directions.
Once the initial hurdles had been overcome and work actually began, the salvage plowed forward at a swift pace.
On the 20th of June, we did the first piece, and then on a weekly basis, all the other pieces from the bow to the stern. Each week we would reduce one piece, weighing about 700 tons, in order to leave space for the next piece.
The barges and cranes that would house the cable for the chain cutters and then lift the massive pieces of metal out of the sea were hauled into position by the high-tech Neri tugs. These small tugs are dwarfed by the ships they must salvage, but their size is no measure of their strength.
The tugs are small with respect to the objects they are called to come and pull, but that is their function, because in these small dimensions, there is a huge amount of power in the engine designed for pulling. It's a bit like a tractor on land. It's not the speed that counts, but the pulling power.
The tugs work throughout the Mediterranean on salvages and on offshore platforms as far away as Africa. They often pull the floating cranes, Meloria and Italia. Their operators are able to maneuver in the most difficult situations, using the tug's pulling force to turn on its own axis.
A tow cable, the main cable, which is often made of steel, is passed to the ship, and then thanks to the pulling power of the tug and the swiveling propellers that can turn 360 degrees, the tug starts towing and is extremely maneuverable because it has these swiveling propellers that allow it to move in every direction.
But as the salvage progressed, engineers would grapple with some major problems caused by the way the ship lay. The chemical tanker had rammed up against volcanic cliffs just around the corner from the beautiful Mediterranean port of Syracuse in March 2012. The disabled vessel would need to be cut up, hauled away to another site in the Santa Panagia Bay, and demolished.
It needed to be removed, not just for the risk it represented, being there, but also because there was the need for the authorities to give a strong and concrete signal that there was the will to address this type of problem.
But before the wreck could be removed, engineers would have to deal with some crucial structural issues.
The center of the ship, section C, had been crushed, and so part of it was stuck on the sea floor. And so we had to rechain up this part, stuck to the bottom of the sea, and pull it up in two sections.
The last piece, rather the second to last, because the stern segment with the engine had already been removed, so the part before the stern, part B, which contained part of the superstructure, the lower part of the superstructure, and the part of the engine, that was the more complex part, because it was the part that had been most damaged. So it couldn't be stabilized on land. We had to prop it up, and we lost a few weeks to prop it up and lower it and then reduce it on land.
Salvage Masters wanted to prevent the ship's engine fluids from leaking into the Mediterranean Sea. So cutting that section took particular care, as did the section of the ship that had caved in after smashing into the rocks.
Sections A and B were the most delicate as far as protecting the environment was concerned, because that is where the motor was. These sections still held pollutants, and it was impossible for the divers to clean out the fuel tank, and it still contained pollutants. But we were able to contain it and resolve it with the floating absorbent barriers.
Port authorities and the Coast Guard had been keeping a close eye on the progress of the salvage.
Today, like every single day since March 10, 2012, we filed a daily report indicating step by step what the situation was, what was being monitored, what the salvage activity was, what authorizations were needed, what the weather and sea conditions were on site, how many men, how many machines, and all this activity was done on a daily basis.
We cut it, and it took us 4 months. The shear legs lifted all the sections of the ship and transferred them to a barge, which had been pulled by tugboats to a pontoon where the demolition yard was.
At the end of the 4 months, media, state and local officials from the Coast Guard were invited to watch the final phase of the salvage be completed. After the last sections were lifted and taken away, the coastline could finally return to its beautiful wild state.
Together with our partners, we cleaned most of the beach area with the stuff that was still on the beach, and for the parts that were on the water, we removed as much as possible.
With the pieces successfully raised, just a few miles down the coast, a local company was preparing for one of its biggest ship demolitions ever. Shipbreaking is a type of ship disposal that involves breaking up the vessels for scrap recycling. The Sicilian company Caschetto had demolished dozens of wooden boats that had carried migrants over the Straits of Sicily. This job was massive in comparison. But with 3 cranes, cutters and grippers all at work, the company set out to begin tearing the tanker apart, bit by bit.
Our company, Fratelli Caschetto, has a history in naval demolition, but this was a big project. We had about 20 people working in full regime. We had a lot of heavy demolition machines working.
Finally, the tanker had been successfully removed from the scenic coastline of Syracuse.
All in all, this was a national victory. In our opinion, it was a feather in the cap for Italian operational and administrative organization.
I would say that there's been positive feedback from everyone. And although some said that there were risks involved, we managed to contain those risks, see them coming, and avoid them so as to ensure that the operation was completed without any problems.
Once again, an environmental disaster in the heart of Sicily's oil refining district had been avoided. But there are those who believe it is only a matter of time before there is another such incident, and that not enough has been done to prepare for that day.
We can't wait for another accident to happen, only to remember and say, "We told you so," but nothing was done. We must do something now, because some of these things cost nothing. It's just a question of common sense. All it takes is to identify the preventive measures that need to be taken. Otherwise, we will have to tell this story once again.
For the time being, however, Sicilians can look out over the cliffs near Syracuse without seeing a wreck that for more than a year was a blight on one of the Mediterranean's most beautiful landscapes. Dawn rises on a hot June day in 1996 over Matagorda Bay, Texas. Archaeologists are excavating the 58-foot French Barque Longue ship that sank in 1686. A groundbreaking cofferdam was built for a scientific salvage operation that would allow shipwreck conservationists to rebuild the doomed ship, finally unlocking its long-held secrets. Austin, the capital city and cultural hub of Texas, finally marked a moment that marine archaeologists, divers, Texas state government agencies, and private donors had been anticipating for 20 years, since the discovery of one of the most important shipwrecks in American history. The hull of the La Belle shipwreck, painstakingly taken apart and put back together, timber by timber, was gingerly placed in its final resting place at the Bob Bullock Texas State History Museum. A world-class exhibit will now house the remains of that ship and many of the 1.6 million artifacts found on board. These finds lay submerged on the floor of Matagorda Bay off the coast of Texas for over 3 centuries. Only today are historians unearthing the whole truth about La Belle, the small ship on a big secret mission to wrest territory from the Spanish. Its sinking changed the course of American history.
There's no better way to learn about historic shipbuilding than to reverse engineer a ship that was built in the historic period. Seldom do you find the entire ship. You find what's left. And nature preserved for us the bottom third of the hull with lots of cargo in there. That cargo represents a kit for building a colony in the 17th century New World.
For nearly 2 decades, Dr. Jim Bruzeth and Dr. Peter Fix have been working on a project to salvage and restore La Belle and its artifacts. Fix is the head conservator in charge of the La Belle archaeological remains, while Bruzeth, a marine archaeologist working for the Texas Historical Commission, took over the archaeological excavation soon after it began.
Inside La Belle, when we excavated the wreck, we weren't certain what we would find, but as time went on, we ended up finding over 1.6 million artifacts in what was actually the preserved bottom third of the hull.
La Belle here behind me is just the largest of the artifacts, but all of these artifacts have been stabilized over the last 17 to 18 years.
I'm guessing right now that the total cost of La Belle from discovery all the way to where we are today, building this beautiful exhibit at the Bullock Texas State History Museum, is going to cost about $18 million.
Bruzeth vividly recalls how his team used ancient maps, journals, and a magnetometer during the initial search for the French explorer's ship.
We decided we were going to go out and find La Belle. It took some time and took a few years and different tries, but eventually in 1995 we went out with our boat, a special boat that had an aluminum hull, and it towed a magnetometer behind it, which is like a super sensitive metal detector.
Shipwrecks such as La Belle contain many iron objects, from their bells to the bolts used to fasten the timbers together. That iron gave away its location. Chuck Mead was one of the divers looking for La Belle. Returning to the site of the La Belle discovery, he recalls how the equipment tipped them off.
All we really knew is that there was a source of magnetism. You know, there was iron somewhere on the seafloor. And that's often a shipwreck, but it's often modern debris, something that we're just not interested in. So we start sending divers down. And of course, we pretty quickly realized what we had.
Chuck's initial find in the murky waters of Matagorda Bay would make history. Here, 20 years later, he went back to see it.
And then all of a sudden, I put my hand down on what feels like a metal handle. It's a solid, it's made of metal, it's attached to something big and heavy, and the very first thing I thought of was like, oh, could this be a cannon? And a few days later, we brought up this beautiful bronze cannon with French wording on it. And we were very excited because we knew we must have an old shipwreck with a cannon, and it's got French writing, and there aren't that many French shipwrecks that have wrecked off the Texas coast.
The stamp on the cannon had the mark of the Comte de Vermandois and a clearly defined serial number, which matched a ledger of weapons belonging to the French Navy at La Rochelle, France.
That was the confirmation we needed that we had found La Belle, what has now become one of the great shipwreck discoveries in North America.
Historians determined the ship was the La Belle, the hardy but small vessel that French explorer Robert Sieur de la Salle used to cross the Atlantic in search of the Mississippi River in an expedition that would last from 1684 to 1686. The team of divers found the cannon and several other small artifacts, but it was soon clear a larger, more complex operation would be necessary. Marine archaeologist Barto Arnold, credited with the La Belle discovery, decided to use a cofferdam, a circular dam that allowed for a dry archaeological excavation.
The methods that are used to excavate an archaeological site, to accurately map in artifacts and record the timbers and other components and features of a shipwreck site, a lot of those methods were developed for high visibility shipwreck sites. And those methods can be very, very accurate and often are. But for blackwater sites, and this is the environment that La Belle is from, where you have zero visibility or less than 6 inches of visibility, those mapping techniques aren't feasible.
We needed to do something different. A traditional underwater diving excavation, which would have been possible, would have been tough. Archaeologists do that, but it would have been tough, and it would have been more difficult to get small, fragile artifacts recovered. So we really thought in a way that hadn't been thought before anywhere in this hemisphere, and that was to build what we call a cofferdam, a giant steel structure around it, and then we pump the water out.
An engineer who specialized in oil rigs was given the job of designing the cofferdam. David Gann knew the area where the ship had sunk like the back of his hand.
But he was familiar with how to, and had worked with building walls with sheet piling. But he had never built anything where, normally the sheet piling is used where you anchor it into land and you come out into the water. Here we were completely out in the middle of Matagorda Bay, and we had to have the sheet piling form basically an oval in the water.
In 1996, the cofferdam was built. Designed in an octagon, it was constructed to withstand the terrible storms and torrential rain and strong gales that are common in Matagorda Bay. The sheet steel piling used on the cofferdam was manufactured specially in steel plants in the state of Pennsylvania, over 2,500 kilometers away. And the steel sheets were made long enough so that they could be driven over 12 meters into the Matagorda Bay clay.
They had to be able to place the sheet piling in such a way that where they started here and they worked on around, that last one had to be absolutely precise so it could slide right down into the place it needed to go.
During construction of the cofferdam, crane operators used a machine called a mechanical vibrator to push these heavy sheets of steel into the bottom of the bay. Roughly 2/3 of the steel sheets were driven underground. Sand was deposited between the two sheet metal walls, 10 meters apart, to separate the center from the bay waters around it and to provide extra strength during storms. At 54 meters long and 40 meters wide, the cofferdam was said to be a gamble. After 1.1 million liters of water were pumped out, excavators and archaeologists could literally walk round and work on the floor of the bay, discovering artifacts. Engineers knew that the cofferdam wouldn't be watertight, but hoped to avoid a bad leak that could be catastrophic to the conservation efforts. Once brought to the surface, the delicate organic material that had been preserved in the oxygen-free environments of the dense clay for centuries, like the rigging and the sails, could just crumble away. These objects were handled with extreme care by expert conservationists.
Underwater archaeology, or nautical archaeology, maritime archaeology, is the only form of archaeology that has to have a conservator attached to the project.
And as we removed those artifacts and examined them, we realized what we had is what I call a kit for building a colony in the New World. These are the objects that an explorer coming to the New World in the late 17th century felt like he needed to build a successful colony.
The colony kit, loaded on La Salle's 4 ships, included 2,700 pounds of raw iron stock for making and repairing iron tools, 650 pounds of steel stock, 2 sets of church furniture, around 600 pounds of tools for carpenters, tradesmen and craftsmen, and countless other provisions that were essential for building a colony.
I mean, the colony kit, it certainly had the sort of day-to-day things you think of. There was a box full of cooking equipment. So you have brass colanders and brass pots and all the stuff you would have needed to cook. And they weren't part of the ship. I mean, these were things which they were bringing for the colony.
We found metal candlestick holders. We found dishes. We found jars that contained medicines. We found the remains of the animals that they ate. We found the actual bones, including the bones of the shipwreck, the common shipwreck.
And then you also have really what you need to build a colony. So you have casks full of nails. They brought blacksmithing equipment, so when they got there they could take the raw iron they had and turn it into tools. And then they had pre-made tools, such as axes, which they would have needed to cut down trees, work wood. So you have a lot of those type of objects. We have a lot of stuff that would have been used to build casks, because of course that'd be a really important way to package anything. So you have a whole cooper's bench, which was found in the hull. You have cooper's adzes and axes. All the specialized equipment for those sorts of trades that in a colony you would need to establish, because if you're going to be exporting materials, you've got to send them home in something.
It was clear from these artifacts that this ship's remit was to establish a greater French presence in the New World, which at the time was up for grabs between the British, Dutch and Spanish, all Old World enemies of France. From 1996 to 1997, archaeologists and excavators took the 1 hour and 15-minute boat ride out to the cofferdam twice a day from their headquarters in Palacios, Texas. Visitors came from all over the world to stand on the cofferdam walls and watch the archaeologists and volunteers find these amazing artifacts every day, with the waters of Matagorda Bay surrounding them on all sides.
When we were excavating the Bell shipwreck, and of course we had the cofferdam out here, we had a 17-mile commute. And usually we're pretty exhausted all these months of working, so we try to sleep if we could. So I got pretty good at sleeping in 4 or 5 foot seas.
The wind and waves were a constant reminder of the tragic fate that awaited La Salle's expedition.
I can remember as the sun set and our research vessel was on the horizon and things got pretty quiet out here, it really felt like once you were alone on this very spot, you could really imagine what it was like for these French sailors and colonists who I'm sure felt pretty alone because their home country was very far away and they were in a very rough space. And you think about their hopes and dreams. You think about those hopes and dreams being dashed to pieces when the ship ran aground to a shuddering halt right here on this spot where we are right now. Kind of sent chills down my spine.
In 1996, archaeologists began a massive excavation and salvage project to conserve La Belle, a 17th century barque longue owned by King Louis XIV. Archaeologists needed to confirm their finds, so they asked archivists to scour French and Spanish archives for additional written sources. One of the few surviving French colonists' diaries was key.
Archival records are obviously very important for this. I mean, we're fortunate that we have, from the French, a number of archival documents, and we were assisted by 2 different researchers, Bernard Ayer and John Debray, in the French archives looking up everything they could, and they found a lot of the information on the construction, letters of La Salle, hiring of different individuals who we know who they are now, we didn't know before, and then Jatel's diary, which had been published in the 1800s, or 1700s, I mean, provides this amazing insight into somebody who was really there and tells this really interesting story.
Leading the expedition was the daring Frenchman La Salle, considered one of the most important explorers in American history. La Salle was from the city of Rouen, famous today for its beautiful cathedral. He left the Jesuit order to explore across the ocean from the French Atlantic coast.
In the United States, La Salle is very famous. He's one of the great explorers. He did great deeds of exploration in the Great Lakes. He built the first sailing ship on the Great Lakes. He discovered the mouth of the Mississippi River in 1682 and claimed all that land for France. That later became the Louisiana Purchase, measurably adding to the territory of the United States. The United States, in making that purchase, argued that Texas should be part of it because of LaSalle being in here in Texas. So the Texas part of the overall LaSalle explorations impacted the development of the United States as well.
For the French at this time, they wanted access, better access to the Americas, better ports, particularly in the south, which aren't choked with ice in the winter. But this would be invading on Spanish territory. So especially at the time that LaSalle's expedition set sail, there was conflict in Europe between France and Spain. And this was a way, in many ways this was a provocation if they got caught, but it was also an attempt on the part of the French to claim more securely lands that were in North America that would provide them resources.
LaSalle had made a case to King Louis XIV that France could gain immense wealth by establishing this colony at the mouth of the Mississippi River that would be a major hub for French trade in the New World. The La Belle set sail in 1684 as part of an expedition that had around 400 passengers and crew, comprising soldiers, clergy, and colonists.
LaSalle came over with 4 ships. 2 ships, La Belle and Le Jali, were given to him by the king. He leased a 3rd ship, Le Mab, from a merchant to bring over, and then a 4th ship he leased, St. Francois. So the 4 ships came over. He lost his first ship as he was in the Caribbean, stopping in today's Haiti. He stopped there for a period of time, and just before he did that, the St. Francois, which was a slower catch, that's the type of ship it was captured by pirates or privateers, we don't know which. But people captured it for the cargo, and we don't know what happened to the small crew that was on that ship.
After the Saint Francois was taken, LaSalle's company soon understood that this expedition would not be as easy as previously thought.
So LaSalle continued on from the Caribbean, headed towards the Mississippi River mouth, missed it, landed in the Texas coast with 3 ships. A 2nd ship, Le Jali, had the orders to simply offload cargo, offload colonists, and sail back to France. And it did do that after it was here on the Gulf Coast for about 3 months, and it went back and made it successfully to France.
La Jolie, the small fleet's gunship, abandoned the expedition to return to France.
So ultimately, in late 1685, LaSalle was down to a single ship, La Belle, as his lifeline to get help if things went really bad for his colony.
Losing l'Aimable prevented LaSalle from perhaps completing a secret mission given to him by King Louis XIV, one that would have brought great wealth and revenue to France.
The majority of the money coming out of the Americas was in the trade in animal pelts. I think, and I'll quote him wrong here, but Louis XIV at one point made a comment that rather than animal pelts, he wanted silver from his colonies, like the Spanish were getting. So aware that these materials were available in the Americas and having had very little success finding similar deposits up in the north, they took a strong interest in acquiring that land.
LaSalle had an assortment of firearms and arms material that he brought with them, that in addition to forming a colony in the Gulf, which was supposed to be at the mouth of the Mississippi, LaSalle was also supposed to use this area as pretty much a staging area for maybe a later military engagement against the Spanish to try to take the Spanish mines.
Geographical knowledge being as it was at the time, they didn't really understand the scale of what they were proposing. They didn't realize that it wasn't just an easy jaunt over to the silver mines from the Mississippi.
The colony kit, it turns out, also included over 400 firearms, as well as boxes full of swords and pole arms that were also recovered from La Belle's hull.
With the guns, there were petards, which is a very small explosive device that is often used to be affixed to doors, to blow in doors in fortifications. So we had petards, we had fire pots, we have pole arms. These are edged weapons. We have swords and these light muskets and buccaneer guns.
Amy Borgens has photographed thousands of artifacts found in La Belle's hull, but firearms and weapons are her primary area of expertise.
Actually, I love the fire pots. For me, those are really exciting because it's a, it's a very dangerous weapon. The fire pots we have are explosive weapons. They contain a grenade. Some of them historically had more of a flammable liquid, so that when you threw them and they broke, they may cause a fire, but they wouldn't explode. They weren't explosive in the same way. But what I loved about it was the ceramic container itself. It just looks very benign and kind of harmless.
I'm not aware of any place in the world elsewhere that they have been found together like that, that you can peer back into the mind of what a French explorer needed to build a colony in the New World. But those artifacts in total are an amazing collection to allow us to understand how these colonies in North America and throughout the Americas were developed, how they were supplied. And La Belle is absolutely unique in telling us that story.
As archaeologists were uncovering the story of La Salle's presence in Matagorda Bay, word spread fast all over the world about the amazing artifacts being found in the cofferdam. La Belle's ownership came into dispute.
A short time later, a claim arrived at our offices from the French government, a claim for La Belle. They said that La Belle belonged to France, and they had submitted the claim to our U.S. State Department. U.S. State Department forwarded the claim to our governor's office, and the governor's office sent it to my office. And at first I was just, really upset about this, that we found this ship in Matagorda Bay, an interior bay of the United States. How could it possibly be claimed? And this wasn't fair, I thought.
La Belle is the property of the Republic of France. We came to realize that thanks to research that established that this was part of what the King of France considered to be his fleet.
We researched it further and learned that they were claiming the ship under international law of the sea, and that law basically says if you have a vessel that's on an official naval expedition authorized by the government, then no matter when the ship goes down, it's still owned by the flag nation, in this case France.
So when that came to light, there was a discussion between France and the United States, and of course the Texas Historical Commission, as the ones who discovered the ship and who recovered the ship from the bottom of the bay, from the bottom of Matagorda Bay. That required a lot of negotiation, discussion.
The United States, with the Texas Historical Commission, signed an international agreement with France that states, "The wreck of La Belle shall remain in the custody of the Commission for a period of 99 years from the date of entry into force of this agreement, which period shall be automatically renewed unless the parties agree otherwise." Meanwhile, in Texas, various experts at the Conservation Research Lab, as well as archaeologists, worked tirelessly to conserve not only the artifacts, but also the hull of La Belle in its entirety, after the ship's timbers were traced out on clear plastic sheets.
Waterlogged wood is not a material we generally think about for engineering. You wouldn't take this timber now and put it in your house as a foundation or studs in the wall. Over time, primarily through bacterial action, fungal action, a little bit of sort of a hydrolysis process, the cellular structure begins to break down.
In order to rebuild the hull of the ship, a carbon fiber and steel composite frame was built to support each timber. Custom steel bolts were used in the exact dimensions of the original holes that the 17th century shipwrights made while nailing the timbers together.
If any of this timber were to just be brought out of the ocean, laid out on the deck in a matter of hours, depending on how hot and humid it was, it would start to cup, it would start to move, it would dry out uncontrollably, and the forces and the tension on the degraded timber would crack it, split it, Eventually, when it was really dry, there'd be no binding or little binding material involved. It would probably just powder to pieces in a lot of spots.
Dr. Peter Fix has been working on the reconstruction of the La Belle shipwreck. In addition to being an expert in shipwreck timbers, he has worked for years in the conservation of the nearly 1.6 million artifacts found on La Belle.
We have processed all of the materials coming from La Belle. That would involve bringing in, accepting, documenting, photographing, drawing, sketching the artifact as it comes into the lab. It may involve, depending on what it is, it may involve x-rays, it may involve further analysis through spectrometry or x-ray fluorescence or x-ray diffraction to determine what the best way of stabilizing that material will be.
Some of these items were so heavily corroded when they arrived at the A&M research lab, it was difficult for scientists to determine exactly what objects they were. Most artifacts brought out of the ocean environment cannot easily stay intact without proper preservation techniques. When a concretion arrives at the lab, conservationists can use it like a mold to make a nearly exact replica of the artifact. To do this, they drill a hole in it and pour in a plastic epoxy. Once the plastic hardens, skilled workers take electric chisels and slowly chip away at the concretion. What is left inside is often a near-perfect cast of the original object. The Conservation Research Lab here in Bryan, Texas, uses electrolysis to remove corrosion caused by oxidization on iron, bronze, and steel. Each tarnished artifact is submerged in a vat with a liquid containing a chloride solution. An electric pulse is sent through the vat, separating the corrosion from the artifact by changing the charge of the ions. This process attaches the corrosion to the charged ions, separating it from the artifact. The result makes the 300-year-old bronze cannon look newly forged. The lab is directed by one of the pioneers of these maritime archaeology conservation techniques.
We had to keep in mind that this ship does belong to France, and so we had to get an okay from France as to the major conservation decisions we made.
Dr. Donnie Hamilton has been doing this for 30 some odd years now and is acknowledged as one of the experts in the field. And the Conservation Research Lab has probably processed more bulk materials than any other lab in the country.
And it was decided a long time ago that we would do it by the 2-bath polyethylene glycol. Polyethylene glycol, it looks like a wax, but it's water soluble. And what it does, it just simply goes in as the water comes out, the polyethylene glycol goes in, and it just keeps the wood from shrinking and warping.
Treating La Belle in a polyethylene glycol bath allowed the CRL to work on the conservation of the hull completely intact. Ideally, they would be able to do this process twice to allow the chemical to fully penetrate the timbers. Although the Conservation Research Lab had given La Belle's hull its first bath, the planned second bath of the polyethylene glycol, or PEG, would cost over $1 million just to fill up the giant vat custom built for La Belle. To cut costs, the Conservation Research Lab scrapped the second bath and decided to use a giant freeze dryer instead.
It comes out with a much lighter color wood, a much lighter in weight wood, and each treatment, once you load the vat up, it only takes essentially 3 to 5 months to treat it. If we'd gone with the original treatment, it would have been a good 2 years before we'd been finished. And so we switched from it. And freeze drying is a very simple process.
The wood would have to be put through the machine in different batches, each batch taking several months to go through the freeze-drying process. So, after reconstructing the entire ship's hull to get it through the PEG bath, they would have to take it apart again, piece by piece. In the freeze dryer, each timber was frozen. Once the timbers were frozen, the freeze dryer turned into a vacuum, turning the ice crystals in the wood directly into a gas. This process, like with freeze-dried food, is called sublimation and works to preserve these organic materials.
Well, this is a big day in the conservation of the bale material. It started arriving from the excavation primarily in the first part of 1997. So by May of 1997, all the artifacts had been delivered here for conservation. So now we've been conserving the artifacts for 17 years, and this is the last load of the wood of the hull, and so to finish the reassembly in the Bob Bullock Museum.
Dr. Donnie Hamilton and staff are pushing the last lot of timber out of the freeze dryer to be packed up and loaded onto the climate-controlled truck. After the freeze drying process, the timbers take on the hue or color that they would have had as brand new pieces of wood cut by the 17th century shipwrights. From here, the outer planking, which will be the most visible, was wrapped and transported from the conservation lab to the museum in Austin. When the timbers are finally put back together and bolted in place, the result of the conservation efforts is remarkable.
To me, it's terribly exciting in that I'm not aware of any place else in the world people are putting together an ancient shipwreck and inviting the public to come and watch us, ask us questions, and let us tell them what we're learning by putting that ship back together.
Here in Austin, Texas, conservationists and maritime archaeologists have reverse engineered a 17th century ship once thought lost forever. Today, it is being pushed into the museum's main atrium. Extensive work has been done to reconstruct La Belle's hull the way it was found nearly 20 years ago at the bottom of Matagorda Bay. Holding it together is a composite carbon fiber steel frame that is tilted 21 degrees, so when the masts are added and the ship is set, it will look like it did the day it sank. Journalists from around the United States are here to document the final step in La Belle's long, sad saga, as Dr. Jim Bruzeth and Dr. Peter Fix move the entire hull into its final resting place. This ship is direct evidence of a major historical moment.
Without this impetus, without this catalyst, I don't know what would have unfolded after many centuries. If we would be as Hispanicized, we are Texans, and as Hispanicized as we are, thanks to the French. It was a game changer, it really was.
La Belle is a shipwreck that changed Texas history and American history to a certain extent. If La Belle had not gone down, LaSalle's colony likely would have been successful, and our heritage, I think, in Texas today would be much more like New Orleans, where you have a French heritage as your past.
The story of La Belle attracted New York Times best-selling author Stephen Harrigan, who traveled down to Fort St. Louis with Dr. Jim Bruzeth to study the site of LaSalle's failed attempt at the first European settlement in Texas. 30 miles inland, up Garcitas Creek, near modern-day Port Lavaca, Texas, is where LaSalle decided to locate his new colony. He chose this humid, mosquito-infested swamp because it was on the highest point around for optimal defense. Because the area is underdeveloped, the threat of rattlesnakes and alligators is constant. In case of encounter with these deadly animals, a herpetologist and an armed guard accompany the crew. In LaSalle's colony, terrible mistakes put them in even more danger.
The problem for LaSalle is that when he was here, initially his interaction with the native Karankawa people was very positive. But at some point, some of his men stole some canoes from the Karankawa people And that started the animosity and the warfare between the French and the Karankawa people. You got to look at it from the standpoint that the Karankawa, they were a mobile people, and so those canoes were the very existence of their mobility.
Here in this marshy land, the trees were thin and wispy, like overgrown weeds, mostly unsuitable for construction. With resources scarce, the Karankawas and French colonists alike struggled to find materials to build their communities.
House, and he used timbers from the wreck of the ship Le Mab, one of his ships that wrecked coming into Matagorda Bay, but they were able to scavenge a number of the timbers from it, and he brought them up here and used to build his French building that was the main place where when the Indians would attack, the settlers would all come and get into that building. He also cut down trees that were some distance away and brought the timbers back here to add on to that structure.
Thanks to Henri Joutel's surviving journal and letters, archaeologists and historians can paint a picture of what the conditions of Fort St. Louis would have been like in the autumn of 1685. One colonist died after being bitten by a rattlesnake. An alligator took another. Colonists learned to stay close to the buildings of their post. Unable to navigate up the shallow Garcitas Creek, La Belle was left in the deeper waters of the bay. In February 1686, a fierce storm blew in that forced the ship towards shallow waters and ran it aground. Most of La Belle's crew made it back to report the loss of the vessel, but one crew member perished. His skeleton was found in the hull centuries later.
I'm convinced that even though LaSalle would have eventually, if La Belle had not gone down and been lost in a storm, would have found the mouth of the Mississippi River and built his colony there. But I feel confident he would have kept something over in this area here, particularly, as I mentioned earlier, looking at it as sort of a possible staging point for an invasion into northern Mexico. So I think it's entirely reasonable in my perspective that if the French settlement had lasted, that our heritage would be more like New Orleans, and we would not have the Hispanic heritage that we have today. Steve, what's your take on all that? You're writing a history of Texas.
I think you're exactly right. I think this is a pivot point of Texas history right here where we're standing. You know, I mean, it could have gone French, could have gone Spanish.
With their lifeline back to France severed, LaSalle and some men, including Henri Joutel, began making their way towards the nearest French settlements, more than 2,000 kilometers to the north, in what is today Illinois.
Once La Belle went down in that storm with all of its supplies for the Mississippi River colony, LaSalle knew that his colony was on the very edge of complete failure, and so that's when he decided he was going to have to take 17 men, leave this area, and walk to Canada to get help.
On the way to Canada, things for LaSalle took a turn for the worse.
And as we know, on the way his men shot him around Navasota, Texas, and that ended the French effort to colonize. So really, it's La Belle and it's the sinking of that ship that changed our history.
Stephen Harrigan believes LaSalle's domineering personality may have led to him being killed by his own men.
Definite explorer personality, too. I mean, he has that in common with almost any of these guys. Yeah, but that's the drive.
In his journal, Henri Joutel also wrote about the roses brought from France and planted on site. Though the fort was burned down and most of the colonists massacred by the Karankawas, those rose bushes still grow wild to this day.
Historical events oftentimes change on small issues, in small ways, and here it's the sinking of a ship that changed our history from what might have been a French history and opened the door for a Spanish history. And LaSalle being in this part of the New World that Spain claimed back in the 17th century, and La Belle being here, is what awakened Spain to realize that if they were going to hold on to what is today's Texas, and they had nobody up here occupying it, if they were going to hold on to this land, they needed to send people up here because the French would come back again and try and conquer and occupy this part of the New World.
That is exactly what the French did in 1718, when the French Mississippi Company founded New Orleans. The French influence in Louisiana is still very visible today in the architecture of churches and buildings throughout the southeast. La Salle is a hero here, revered as the first explorer to sail down the Mississippi all the way to the Gulf of Mexico. Many French and Creole French speakers also moved to Louisiana, especially after the Haitian Revolution, leaving a mix of cultures brought from the descendants of Native Americans and African slaves brought over by the French. At night, New Orleans comes alive with the sounds and music preserved from this eclectic mix of cultures. A very different place from Texas.
There's this mystique about Texas, and there's, you know, for good or bad, they understand that we're about cowboys and cattle and all of that. Well, those are grounded in our Spanish heritage. Well, our Spanish heritage is as rich as it is in Texas because the Spanish found out that La Salle, this French explorer, had intruded on the territory of New Spain.
The legacy of La Belle is of lasting importance, both historically and technologically. The sinking of this tiny vessel may have altered the course of history in the Old and New World. The cofferdam was both a staggering feat of engineering and a gamble that paid off for archaeologists on this scientific salvage. The conservation strategies used to excavate and preserve the ship and all its artifacts will be used as examples of maritime archaeological techniques for decades to come.
This is really a textbook example. I mean, any student of marine archaeology, of shipwreck archaeology, is going to read about the Belle, is going to learn about the Belle.
La Belle may have been a small ship, but she left a very large wake, one that is still rippling across the world today. From the urban scar of America's most traumatic moment in recent history to the windswept plains of Texas, the story of the United States' most symbolic relic of a bygone era is one of regeneration and rebirth over the centuries. The wooden skeleton has come to be known as the World Trade Center ship. Workers are digging in the mud that was once the Hudson River, now nearly a kilometer away from the waterfront, the site of the most outrageous act of terror in America's history. They are part of a massive urban regeneration project to bring life back to the World Trade Center Plaza. A wooden skeleton appears at the bottom of the pit. The ribbing and woodwork are painstakingly excavated at record speed, as construction cannot be held up in the city that never sleeps. What they find has come to represent the miraculously preserved roots of the world's greatest trading city, New York.
Every morning we went in, we walked by the fire station where all those guys had died. We walked right by their station and then into the site. It's touching. And everybody felt that. I mean, the workmen, the archaeologists, the press who came, everybody knew they were on hallowed ground.
7 years later, the story and the ship has moved far from New York across the country to Texas. Another scorching day starts over the wooded southern plains. Here, students of the Texas A&M University at College Station work in one of the world's foremost marine archaeology and conservation centers. This is where the single most symbolic ship artifact in the history of the United States is being cured, conserved, and prepared for exhibition. Postgraduate student Meredith Stoops is preparing one of the timbers for scanning to create a scale model of the ship.
Even as you're working and it's a very monotonous routine, you kind of understand how significant the ship can be to others and where it was found. And I don't always keep that in mind, but then it comes back to you and you realize this is an important ship. Even if it was just a Hudson sloop, it's now quite important as to where it was found.
The bedrock of the World Trade Center was this ship that was ultimately preserved by this terrible destruction that happened in 2001.
All these little boats from all along the East Coast, the Caribbean, the Gulf Coast, much later on the West Coast, they were the pickup trucks. They were the vehicles that people just used every day to put something here and take it there.
Donnie Hamilton is the director of the Conservation Research Laboratory, one of the most advanced specialized laboratories in the world, founded more than 40 years ago. Peter Fix, archaeological conservator, manages nautical artifacts that come here. The timbers are at the center to be conserved and prepared for exhibition, and it is here where their deepest secrets will be revealed.
There's less than a third of the ship left, but we have enough historic data and other period ships and some ship plans that we can probably reasonably recreate it using these particular dimensions. Our ship modeler is pretty good at taking minimal remains and coming up with a fairly realistic representation of what it originally looked like.
There are about 400 large pieces and another 200 smaller pieces that had broken off and were just associated. We received just an entire box of their only identification is found outside. So they could be part of the hull. We'll have to see if we can locate and find a home for them in the future.
Early morning, September the 11th, 2001. Two passenger aircraft crash into the World Trade Center towers, one after the other. A massive fire erupts as the full fuel tanks of the aircraft explode. The heat reaches thousands of degrees centigrade and begins warping the steel columns that hold the buildings up, as firemen rush to the scene and evacuate all those trapped in the lower floors for the next 55 minutes. Then, one by one, floor by floor, first one, then both buildings collapse, folding in on themselves and on top of the people still trapped inside. It is the most horrific terror attack against the United States ever, and brutally ends an era of unequaled peace and prosperity in world history. For the next 9 years, the United States and New York struggle with the impact of the attack. A new tower rises from the ashes. Two great cavities with waterfalls have been created where the Twin Towers once stood, and a single new skyscraper rises in their place, the One World Trade Center. The memorial flag in the adjacent square is permanently at half-mast, but the square is one of the city's tourist attractions. Warren Rees has returned here to see what has become of one of the most significant archaeological finds in American history, one that he helped excavate. Lying under this parking garage, just south of the South Tower, is the place where archaeologists found what has become known as the World Trade Center ship, one of the nation's most extraordinary discoveries, but also one of its least celebrated.
To me, the heavy construction of it, well, so were the towers, you know, but they're gone. Nothing we built is eternal.
During the slow process of repurposing the whole area, the archaeologists of engineering consultant firm AKRF are contracted by the Lower Manhattan Development Corporation to recover any artifacts of significance. Michael Papalardo, senior archaeologist at AKRF, coordinates the work on the ground.
Well, AKRF's initial involvement stretches back to the years after 9/11, as the city of New York planned the rebuilding process and reconstructing Lower Manhattan. One of the sites was south of the World Trade Center, that it was an area sensitive for the presence of the landfill retaining devices, the timber structures that were used as they built the city out westward into the Hudson River.
As the ancient timbers emerge from the mud, the archaeologists realize that what they have stumbled on is a mystery ship, a time capsule, inexplicably buried for centuries under the layers of New York. The find is potentially laden with significance. Mike Papalardo turns to America's leading ship archaeologist, Warren Reese.
The ship was sitting down about 20-some feet below the street level, and it was in the middle of a large area that was being excavated for the construction. So we were just south of the South Tower, what had been the South Tower of the World Trade Center. And we're looking at the bottom timbers of a ship, a small ship, and we had, it looked like about 50 feet of it at a quick glance. We had 5 minutes to look at it before we had to go to a planning meeting.
The ship, the condition of the wood was simply remarkable. The wood was buried beneath many, many feet of water-saturated silts and clays. And that environment is anaerobic, so there's the normal processes of breaking down organic matter weren't continuing. They had continued for some period of time before the ship was buried. So the portions of the ship that had a higher elevation than the river bottom had rotted away.
So the amazing archaeological adventure begins, with time ticking. The long working days end in the Irish pub nearby, where archaeologists marvel and reflect on the meaning of what they have found.
Day one.
Over 5 days, 2 teams work to extract the ship from the Manhattan mud. A team from New York, under the leadership of Michael Papalardo, and a team from Maine, directed by Warren Reese. After just a few days, they have an idea of what kind of ship it is and the symbolism of where it lay.
We were given a week and told us we could work as many hours as we could in 5 days, basically. And they gave us a week to get ready. So I brought in, besides the AKRF archaeology team, which was great, I brought in some ship specialists that it was students who'd work with me.
Although the work has to be done quickly, the team nevertheless takes every precaution to record the exact location of every artifact. The ship is a historical puzzle, and every clue is vital to decoding its secrets.
Because it had to happen so fast, everybody makes mistakes, but when you're moving that fast, we I just figured we were going to make a lot of mistakes. So in archaeology, you have one shot. It's not like other sciences where you can redo the experiment. You take one layer, you record it, and you destroy it. So you got to do it right. And so normally we record things in about 3 different ways. We draw things, we measure things, we map things. And in addition to that, we used a laser, a 3-dimensional laser, recording every day of it at noontime, and then right after that we had 3-dimensional spherical photography done on the site, so that whatever we missed one way, we'd pick up the other.
Some artifacts are the types of objects that are dumped in as disposing of garbage. There were many businesses in the area, and as the ships would bring goods off of the, would bring goods into the city, they'd be brought off the ship, and some would fall into the open water. So some of the artifacts were simply lying on the river bottom. Other artifacts were perhaps associated with the ship itself. You know, they are artifacts that were being stored in the ship or used by the people that operated the ship. And then other artifacts were in the fill that was used to raise the elevation of this area as the land was filled in.
I thought we had the bow because it was very rounded, and the frames were what we call canted. So I thought we had the bow. As we proceeded down, though, it became obvious from some of the construction there, meaning that there was a stern post that came up, and there are things called gudgeons, which are like part of a hinge on the back of the vessel that the pintles from the rudder stick in so the rudder can move. And we started seeing, uh-oh, we've got the stern.
As the ship emerges from the debris and mud, more of its details become apparent. An odd item of wood raises many questions.
Another odd thing about the construction was the stern. Now, the stern is made up of a number of heavy timbers normally. This one, it was one piece, one 600-pound piece of oak that had been carved, beautifully carved, to function as what we call the stern knee that would be right at the end, and what's called the deadwood underneath, all one piece. Never seen that before.
It's a fabulous piece of wood. It's, I think, 11 feet long, about 2 feet wide, and what remains going up towards the transom remains about 2.5, 3 feet. It weighs 500, we weighed it out. Currently, pre-conservation, it weighs 545 pounds. So it's a hefty piece of timber. So I mean, I don't know if anyone can specifically interpret an exact reason, but it is a wonderful piece of wood.
More yet emerges. There are signs the ship sailed as far as the Caribbean.
The other thing was that it obviously had teredo shipworm all through the outer hull. Okay, that's not uncommon. What was uncommon was that it didn't have an outer sheathing to protect it, as if it wasn't made to go into warm salt water. And when we got the information back from Kevin Eckelbarger, who's with me at the University of Maine, that these were warm water species. And okay, so here's a vessel that's flat-bottomed, double-ended, big sloop, and it's going to the Caribbean, maybe Bermuda. It made sense.
The ship's hull is extraordinarily shallow in the water, another clue as to its category.
We got down to the keel at the very bottom of the vessel, and it was 4 to 6 inches. So here you have a sailing vessel that's 50 to 60 feet long, maybe 20 feet wide, with a keel that couldn't stop that vessel from going sideways in the wind. There are no centerboards. They didn't have centerboards yet at that point. So what was keeping this vessel from going sideways? Maybe a lee board, which would be a board on the side of the vessel that you drop down with, so and then you can pick it up. It's on a hinge. Normally you'd have two, but some vessels had one. But we didn't have the upper part of the vessel, so we couldn't tell if this one had lee boards or not.
Lee boards have been used for centuries in flat-bottomed boats, such as this Dutch sloop, seen in the Harlingen to Terschelling race. These boats, too, have rounded sterns. As the timbers are removed and mapped, certain construction characteristics begin to surprise the archaeologists, ones that will later be a source of concern for the conservators.
In the 18th century, almost every vessel, those planks and the outer planks are attached to the rest of the ship with wooden pegs called trunnels. It comes from the word tree nail. And this had 2 or 3 trunnels in the whole vessel. Everything was put together with iron nails. Very, very uncommon. In fact, quite rare. I'd never seen one in person because that was a very expensive way to make a vessel. And those ships had to go through storms. Well, if you have oak and pine and iron and it starts working, the iron's going to start cutting the wood around it.
Most of the ship was iron fastened. I believe I'd have to go look at the records, but I think there are 3 or 4 trunnels that were actually found. But the overwhelming majority of materials were iron. And that's very quick. And it looks, you can interpret some of the labor issues that are going on, the sociological issues that are going on. In fact, if they were doing that, then the product is becoming a lot cheaper than the labor itself.
Once the ship is entirely excavated, nearly 800 artifacts have been collected. Every detail of how they lay in their original position and their spatial relationship with the other pieces around them recorded. The archaeologists and scientists now begin working on the DNA of the ship. Dendrochronology, or tree ring dating, provides a vital clue. Amazingly, this science of dating the timbers shows that the World Trade Center ship was built from the same white oak woodland that was felled to build Independence Hall in Philadelphia, where the United States Declaration of Independence and Constitution was signed.
The FBI and Interpol have software that looks at fingerprints. So if you have someone you think might have done something, you take their fingerprints, and this software goes to everybody's data bank that signed in and compares it. So why don't we do that with dendrochronology, where everybody around the world who signs in makes their data available? We use that same software to do the comparison. And so when they looked at the samples from our vessel, they just put it out, and the software looked and found, oh, someone did that oak tree near Philadelphia, and it's a perfect match for your vessel. It was wonderful.
There were 3 layers of the ship: the inner series of planks, and then the outer layer of planks, and then a series of large structural timbers in between. And they created these small areas where sediments accumulated, and the artifacts in between those, they're called futtocks, between the futtocks were somewhat of a good context archaeologically. It's unlikely that they ended up there from the fill that happened afterwards.
The initial interest in the amazing find wanes as New Yorkers continue to live their busy lives in the financial and trading capital of the world. Little do they know, still today, that deep beneath their vertical city, in the bounds below the subway level, lie other ships. New York has been a trading city since the time of its founding by the Dutch as New Amsterdam in 1625.
I think the English would have probably called a hoy a work vessel. It's a small work vessel from 40 to 60 feet long as a hoy, and it can be a number of shapes. The Dutch would have called something like this, excuse my Dutch, but something like Wildschip, which would be a double-ender sloop about that size, but that was an earlier kind of vessel. I think it's great in a way because we don't know exactly what where it was from, what it was doing.
Back in the day, 100, 150, 200 years ago, everybody had a boat, just about, especially everybody in a seaport town, which is centripetal, not centrifugal. That's why you become so concentrated, because there's no room. Everybody wants to be by the ocean. You grow up on top of yourself. You grow up right by the water. And this ship, the World Trade Center ship, is indicative of that life.
New York was the trading pivot point for the whole of the Hudson River basin. Philadelphia craftsmen built this working boat that sailed down the whole American coast and traded as far inland as Albany. It was based in New York, a city located to take advantage of both access to the sea and major waterways.
So the city was extended outwards hundreds and hundreds of feet over time. It started off on the east side of Manhattan, and they would have to fill in, either fill in land or extend the docks further out into the deeper water. And that was the way the city was able to grow, was through establishing bulkheads and piers and then enclosing them and filling that area in.
Especially right around the Federalist period in the United States, you have an initial boom almost. It is just before the Industrial Revolution, but you can look and trace with some research how things are progressing, and there's an awful large need to move product, to move commerce, and the rise of New York. New York was the pinnacle. I mean, it was the epicenter.
Urban regeneration is an ongoing process here. Buildings are put up and ripped down and rebuilt higher still, a process propelled by access to the Hudson River. The Hudson is a shallow, tidal river, treacherous for the inexperienced sailor. Here at Kingston, a group of volunteers are working on the upkeep of a replica of a Hudson River sloop, although of a later epoch.
So this is a sloop. Sloop is a single-masted sailing vessel. This sloop is a replication of sloops that would have sailed on the Hudson in the 18th and 19th century, carrying cargo from New York City to Albany and back up and down the river. So they are a peculiar design. Designed for sailing in the Hudson. Very large mainsail, tall mast to catch as much or as little, rather, wind there is in the river in the summer months. A wide boat, very stable with a shallow draft because the Hudson is muddy and fairly shallow in a lot of places.
The Hudson River sloop Clearwater is the brainchild of songwriter and activist Pete Seeger, as a way of bringing attention to the devastation of the Hudson River by heavy industry in the post-war era.
From New York City and further south, the sloops would have been carrying finished goods mostly up the river to the farms and communities upriver, and then on the way back down they would have been carrying kind of bulk goods, timber or large quantities of whatever to head to the factories in New York City and stuff. That was the general trend of the pattern of movement of goods up and down the river.
The Hudson River sloops played a key role in building New York. Here in one of New Amsterdam's first roads, Bowery Street, stands Manhattan's oldest bank, founded in 1834. And close by is Chinatown, where brick buildings have stood for hundreds of years. They have become one of the characteristics of central New York and represent building techniques that relied on the import of this light, dependable material. And that had to be transported to Manhattan, down the Hudson River.
The sloops would carry tons and tons of brick up and down the river. I often will tell students, like, next time you're in New York City, take a look around. Like, how much brick do you see? You're going to see a lot of brick. And a lot of that brick came from the Hudson Valley and was shipped to New York on sloops.
New York City is constantly rebuilt, over and over again, each skyscraper standing on the rubble of the previous one. A winter sun sets over New York, where the eternal play of glass and steel reflects in the sea and creates a fairy tale skyline of offices where trade never stops. The World Trade Center ship has left New York for conservation in the nation's foremost marine archaeology laboratory. Here in College Station, Texas, Donnie Hamilton and his team have been able to get an intimate picture of the ship found under Ground Zero. Apart from the excitement of having the World Trade Center ship in their hands, the conservators in Texas have the great responsibility of preserving this highly symbolic artifact. They first have to deal with the serious problems that all the nails in the ship pose.
And so we are just now getting to the process. We've gone through all the rinsing. Obviously, in 5 years, all the soluble salts have been rinsed out pretty much. And so now we've been dealing primarily with removing the iron, and that's pretty much has been done now. And then also we've been scanning all the material with the Faro arm, the 3D scanner, so that we can make a complete digital model of the ship.
For about a year, all the timbers will go into a solution of ammonium citrate, which is a chelation, or it'll actually go in and pull out the iron.
Iron doesn't want to be iron, and so it corrodes. And with salt water, we have a further complication, is that it's now the corrosion products are mixed with the sodium chloride from the salt water. And so when you have sodium chloride, you have ferrous chloride and ferric chloride. Once you expose it to the air and the atmospheric moisture, it converts to hydrochloric acid.
We will start to slowly impregnate polyethylene glycol into the timbers themselves. And once that reaches a certain percentage, we'll then put everything in the freeze dryer for 4 to 6 months, depending on its thickness. And when it comes out, it'll be cleaned and ready to start being reconstructed into the ship itself.
These are all the different vats that have the WTC material in it. They used to be over here being pre-processed, but now they've been measured and scanned, and so we're getting ready to start into the next stage. So we're sequestering all of the iron out of it now, and then they'll be taken after they go through the next treatment and put into the freeze dryer. This is the largest archaeological freeze dryer in the Americas by far. It's 8-foot diameter, 40-foot long, and all computer controlled, and essentially it's used for once we get all the iron out of the wood, and then essentially have it pre-treated polyethylene glycol, then it's put into the freeze dryer. Once the water is frozen and you put it in the freeze dryer, then it goes directly from a solid state to a gas state without going through an intervening liquid state. And it's the liquid state that as it dries, the surface tension of the water pulls all the cell walls together. That's what causes the wood to shrink and collapse, is the surface tension of the water evaporating, pulling the cell walls in. So by going directly to a gas state, we eliminate that problem.
The unit is famed for the 17-year-long conservation of La Belle, a French exploration ship discovered in Matagorda Bay.
When we started the Bell project back in 1995, we thought it was going to be a 5-year project. Well, it turned out to be an 18-year project, and at a cost of over $5 million. And so,
even these, the WTC and the Alexandria, you're talking about more than $500,000 just to do the conservation on these. So the problem is, the cost of doing it. But that's why this lab is a valuable contribution in that we're able to do things here much cheaper than if someone tried to do it on their own and tried to recreate the facilities that we have here.
Meredith Stoops is a volunteer from the Archaeology Postgrad course and has spent months scanning timbers from the World Trade Center ship.
We have to go out to the vats outside and collect individual timbers that we'll bring in to scan. They've been sitting in there for quite a while, so they need cleaned off. The ferro arm is, it collects very minute information, so anything growing on the timber will be picked up easily, so you have to remove anything like that. So after we've cleaned it off, we bring it in, and you'll place one timber down in front of the scanner, scan one side, flip it over, and do the next.
Dr. Christopher Dostal has just finished his doctoral thesis on making a scale 3D model of the World Trade Center ship. Using advanced technology, he and volunteers scan the timbers one by one, keeping them wet constantly.
When you're moving this, it has sensors in each of the articulated joints, and if you put too much pressure on one of the sensors, a warning will come up, it'll stop collecting data. And so we were working out in the bay here, and we started to get a lot of error messages from the base of the previous arm that we had. And so we'd had the arm for 9 years, so at this point it was well out of warranty. I'm by no means an engineer, but I thought, well, maybe it's just a loose wire, or maybe it's something, if I take it apart, it's something I'll be able to see if there's a problem. So I brought the arm next door and laid it out on the table, and once I got the final screw out and I pulled the cover off, just a pile of ants fell out.
Scanning the timbers has given the conservators an incredibly accurate picture of how the ship was built.
I'm recreating the ship exactly as it was in the ground. So whatever distortions there might have been, or, if the wood has changed shape over time, or if pieces are broken and fallen into place, that's all going to be perfectly represented in my model. So I'm doing a very good job of recreating what the ship looked like when it was dug up. What Glenn will be doing is taking the shape of the ship is determined by something we call ship lines. So when you're a shipwright, if you're designing a ship, you loft the shape of the ship with a series of lines that project the space through the different dimensions. And so I'm able to use the model this model here to extract the original lines from the ship and then take those, and now we can extrapolate those to get the rest of the ship.
On the campus itself, the team possesses a little celebrated secret asset. It comes in the form of Glenn Grieco, an expert in wooden ships and, especially, building scale models of them. This is the third model of La Belle that he has built.
We start with the remains, and we try to find similar vessels, similar contemporary vessels, and it's just a lot of research, trying to find drafts if they exist, historic documents that mention the construction, or even information about what materials the vessel was going to be carrying. The hull would have to be designed a certain way to carry certain materials. It really differs per vessel, though.
There's two halves to this, right? So whatever's on the table you can't scan. So you scan the top part and as much of the sides as you can, and then you save that, and then you'll scan the next side as much of the sides as you can. And then once you do that, you can go through and find the same point on both scans and tell the computer, hey, like this little divot here is the same on this scan as it is on this scan, and it'll try and align those two. So if you just keep telling it points over and over again, after about 4 or 5, it does a pretty good alignment. And then what the software will do is it actually track the overlap. It'll sample a certain % of the scan and then refine that alignment.
Scanning the timbers has been complex, and getting the scans of each side to match time-consuming. The match has to be perfect, so that the 3D printer can extrude plastic scale replicas of each timber to build a perfect model, giving Peter Fix and his team something to practice rebuilding the ship with. To make the model accurate, Glenn uses not only all the documentation he can get hold of, but also his own experience in ship lines.
There are 3 or 4 other Dutch vessels that have about the same shape. I looked at all of those to see if there were some features in those that we could use for this. Dutch cargo vessels tend to have very, very full hulls. And in the 1830s and 1840s, when you see what the Hudson River sloops evolved into, they're much finer, much sleeker. So we know this is somewhere in the transition. And looking at the lines that Chris Dostal pulled off of the actual remains, you can see it's a much fuller vessel. And so it still has some of those characteristics of the earlier Dutch vessels.
But so the first thing was to put in the spine and to take those 3 pieces and fix them together. And then the next was to add the keel, the stern knee back here, which is this big piece here, right? This would have been the main structural support for the end. And then attached to the stern knee is the stern post. That's a separate piece here. And if I get close, you see that when I scanned the stern knee, it actually still had a bolt in it in the print as well. The main bolt that fixed the 2 printed perfectly fine. It was scanned perfectly fine. And the hole that it was in scanned fine. So I was able to just use the original fastener to line up the 2.
From the skeleton of the ship, he is able to build a 3D photocopy scale model of the World Trade Center ship, which will allow Glenn Grieco to estimate the ship lines.
First of all, we need to come up with a set of lines for a vessel that approximates the shape. And of course, using all the details that we know from other types of vessels and other vessels from the same period, we'll try to incorporate all those details in and come up with a believable hull that accurately reproduces what the original would have looked like.
So this is basically just melted plastic. And what you do is you put the model in, and then the slicing software analyzes the model and then calculates, it just slices it into a lot of thin layers and calculates the path that a 3D printer head would have to take. Each one of these meshes is added to the slicer software, and then the software goes through and maps the route that that piping bag will have to take to build up to this level.
I think what really helps the most is the work that Peter Fix and Chris Dostal did with not only scanning in all the timbers and coming up with a good set of lines, but also the reconstruction, just reassembling them. That always helps.
It very likely was a very broad, flat-shaped bottom with a fairly hard chine of the bilge here. You can see it's a very hard turn. So it would have just been a shallow, drafted, beamy bus of a boat that could take a lot of people and goods up and down the Hudson River. It almost certainly had a single mast, although we don't have the mast step, but just based on the shape, you couldn't have put more. So there's been a lot of studies of what this ship shape of the Hudson River sloop might be. Regardless of whether or not this matches the previous studies, it was almost certainly a slooped rig boat on the Hudson River.
For many more months, it will be quietly cured and consolidated in the warm rural plains of Texas, where time stands still, before moving back to where it plied its trade, to bear witness to the very origins of New York State, in the freezing northern tip of the United States. On the other side of the United States, far to the north of Manhattan, lies the city of Albany, the capital of New York State. This is where the New York State Museum is housed. Michael Lucas is the curator of historical archaeology.
Well, the first thing is, of course, it's quite rare, and they found the ship, and ships are very interesting for the public, of course, because they're this sort of this little time capsule, a moment sort of in time. And so for me, it was interesting that this particular ship would tie into this larger story of not just New York's role in New York City's role in the development of New York State, but also in the development of the United States during the late 18th and early 19th century. So it's really an interesting way, and the ship sort of becomes a protagonist in this story.
The Dutch didn't have much, you know, in terms of natural resources. They made most of their money by trading with other people and carrying goods on their ships. So they came over here and they looked at Manhattan Island and they said, well, if we have a little settlement at the southern tip of this island, we can control all the trade for this huge hinterland.
Here at the State Museum, we have over 2 million artifacts from Lower Manhattan alone that trace the early European settlements of what was initially New Amsterdam right through the 20th century. So the ship will be a major part of filling a gap in this collection we have to tell the story of how the city grew and how the state grew.
The longtime director of the museum is Mark Sharming, and he has been managing the 9/11 exhibit for a decade. For all New Yorkers, the World Trade Center ship has a special significance.
And so, of course, it's just symbolic that this great tower, this piece of world history, stood over this ship and was never found. I don't know that they knew it was there when they built the towers. They went down to bedrock, but somehow preserved it as well. And then not to be discovered until the towers collapsed and came down. So that story is pretty amazing as well. We would never know about this except for the terrible destruction of the World Trade Center.
New York State was once the gateway to the west and to the north, and the Hudson River was the thoroughfare to the great expanses of North America. The archaeological context of the World Trade Center ship gives us clues to the historical period that it was active in. One of the most startling discoveries was a button of the 52nd Regiment of Foot, a British infantry unit active in the Revolutionary Wars.
In the case of, if this was a ship that was pressed into service during the Revolutionary War, it would have been a troop transport. There was a button that was found that's from the 52nd Regiment of Foot. So it was a Revolutionary War uniform button. Now, does that mean there were soldiers on there from the 52nd? Maybe.
And you know, and what's New York today? You know, it's the trading capital of America, if not part of the world. And where was this vessel? In the World Trading Center, you know, World Trade Center. So it all fits to the history. It has huge significance to Manhattan and America that it was there. Now, it wasn't meant to be, you know, under the World Trade Center, but there it was. So, you know, looking back from the World Trade Center that's been rebuilt now, here's a piece of that history that developed this island.
The mystery ship was built in Philadelphia and sank in New York around the time of the nation's independence. It offers a mere glimpse of what life was like when the city and the nation were young. As millions of the world's downtrodden came to the windswept Hudson to make new lives, the sloop was buried in the foundations of the World Trade Center. 200 years later, the Twin Towers were attacked and destroyed, taking nearly 3,000 lives with them.
I live in a small rural area of Maine, and so everybody has 5 hats, you know, and one of my hats was I was a volunteer fireman, and 33 years. I was a captain at the time the World Trade Center got hit, and was an EMT for 20 years. And so, you know, we saw those guys going in, they didn't come out. 4 of those guys had been our instructors. You know, so I knew 2 of them a little bit. But it wasn't just that, it was this whole concept of these people going, that's what we do, you know. So I had that personal connection too. So when we went to the site, it wasn't just as an American, but it was also the firefighter, EMT, and me, and the archaeologist all coming together. So I'm not an emotional person, but it is pretty emotional for me.
For 250 years, New York City has grown on the remains of humble ships like this one, built with the same wood as Independence Hall. Today, above the very spot where it was found, the glistening One World Trade Center rises into the sky, a towering symbol of the United States of America's resolve to rebuild and remain the global center of commerce. For more than 80 years, the great Norwegian polar exploration ship Maud has been trapped in the ice in a remote bay of Canada's Northwest Passage, her glorious past frozen in time beneath the frigid Arctic waters she was designed to navigate. Today, a trio of passionate Norwegians have raised the ship as part of an epic attempt to bring her back home to the bay in Oslo Fjord where she was built. Cambridge Bay in winter. Temperatures drop to -40 degrees in the Arctic Circle, just 2,331 kilometers from the North Pole. The flat, white horizon stretches out for miles, empty except for the massive hull of the Arctic exploration ship Maud, resting atop the ice. Maud's story goes back a century. She was the creation of the great Norwegian explorer Roald Amundsen, who spent most of his life venturing to the farthest reaches of the globe. He was the first man in history to sail the treacherous Northwest Passage linking the Pacific and Atlantic Oceans, and the first person to reach both poles. He had lived with the Inuit for 2 years and learned crucial skills for surviving in the Arctic that would serve him well in 1911, when he became, famously, the first man to the South Pole. For nearly a century, Maud lay beneath the surface of these remote, frigid waters until she was lifted to the surface in the summer of 2016 by 3 ambitious and creative Norwegian men led by Jan Vanguard, a former world windsurfing champion and artist. Vanguard, Bjorn Myran and Stig Petersen hatched an unorthodox, do-it-yourself plan to salvage Maud from the harshest conditions of the Arctic North. 6 years later, they are finally preparing to bring her back home to Norway.
Amundsen was a man who was very good at encouraging or to motivate people to join him on different kind of challenges, and the Maud expedition was developed into a very sophisticated scientific expedition, and today it's considered one of the most important scientific expeditions ever in the polar region.
If something doesn't work, we make it work, always. And Jan, if he has some, what do you call it, resistant, it's something that doesn't work, he just put in more energy, and we always come a little bit further. We never give up.
Somebody has to take the initiative, and if it has not been now, it might never have happened.
While Amundsen returned from the South Pole expedition, a hero and in good health, his ship, the Fram, had dry rot and was no longer seaworthy. With his popularity at an all-time high and financiers ready to fund his trip, Amundsen set out to custom build a ship that could reach the North Pole. His plan was to let his ship be frozen in by the ice on the eastern side of the Siberian coast and drift with the ice across the polar basin. Here in Oslo, the Fram Museum holds the artifacts that Amundsen brought back from his polar expeditions, as well as the Fram itself. Amundsen decided to base his new ship on the same principles as the Fram. Throughout the Maud salvage project, Jan has come here for vital technical clues.
They took the ideas from Fram and developed them to a better solution for the ice. And you can see it very well that it's a bit different from Maud. The shape of the hull is more like a V shape. And when Maud was built, she was made more or less like a circle in the section. So that's very interesting for us to see.
Norway became independent from Sweden in 1905, and the new king, Håkon, was married to Queen Maud, the youngest daughter of the British king Edward VII. Amundsen decided to name the ship after her, as his expeditions so contributed to the new Norwegian patriotic fervour. Construction began in 1916, here in Vålen, a small town on the fjord south of Oslo. She was designed to be the strongest ship ever, capable of withstanding the crushing pressures of ice plates on the North Pole pressing against her hull. Amundsen hired the most talented shipbuilders of the time, Anker and Jensen, to draw up the first designs. The ship would need a special, rounded, bathtub shape and extra strength, but still be light so it could be pushed up rather than crushed by moving ice flows. It was decided to make the ship broader in the beam forward and narrower astern. The hull could have no cross timbers, but extra special attention would have to be paid to the joinings, shifts and fastenings. 3 layers of oak planks were bolted together, with 12 by 12 frame timbers running from deck over keel to deck. Like its predecessor, the Fram, the Maud would have a retractable propeller that could be pulled up into the ship so as not to be damaged by shifting ice.
They both had this quite smart principle that you could lift the propeller and the rudder up into the hull of the ship. And in this way, when they got frozen in the ice, there was no need for the propeller and the rudder for maybe several years. So to protect them, because they're very vulnerable to the movement of the ice, they could pull them up and protect them from this.
1 year after construction began, the Maud was launched to great fanfares in June of 1917. Amundsen christened her not with champagne, but with a lump of ice. "You are made for the ice. You shall spend your best years in the ice, and you shall do your work in the ice. With the permission of Her Majesty the Queen, I name you Maud." The house near Oslo, where Amundsen spent his Norway days, has been preserved as a museum. Among his belongings are a framed photo of Maud being launched. She would become his home for more than 4 years. She overwintered here in Oslo's main harbour and departed Norway July 1918 with the aim of lodging in the ice pack above the Bering Strait in order to drift across the Arctic Ocean. She had been equipped with scientific instruments from the Carnegie Institution, while renowned Bergen oceanographer Harald Sverdrup was the scientist in charge. The plan was to remain trapped in the ice to drift across the North Pole. During their first winter, frozen in Cape Chelyuskin, Amundsen suffered a series of setbacks. He was attacked by a polar bear, fell into the ice, and suffered from carbon monoxide poisoning. For 2 winters, the vessel was icebound off the Siberian coast, with the men surviving on fish, seal and walrus hunted through the ice. They lived with the Chukchi tundra people and used dog sledges to send crew members out, sometimes on 1,500-kilometer-long trips, to telegraph stations on Dixon Island and Nome, Alaska, to send news of the expedition to the newspapers.
Going on long trips with this dog sledge, they were very dependent on knowing how far they were traveling. And by having this wheel hanging behind the sledge, they can They can measure the distance. Each revolution of the wheel is counted on the little register box. So after one day of dog sledging, they can know exactly how far they have traveled.
In 1919, his fellow explorer Oscar Wisting described in his ship's diary the heavy ice pressure against the Maud. The ice cracked and crashed and rumbled, and the timbers of the Maud groaned as the ship shook and trembled. In the hold, we could see how the props, beams and stanchions vibrated, but the Maud suffered no serious damage. With the spring thaw, it appeared the ship would be keeled over. The dogs were shifted to the ice and the sleds packed with an evacuation imminent. But, true to her robust construction, Maud never succumbed to the ice. After forced returns to Nome, Alaska, and later for repairs in Seattle, in 1922 they were ready to make a new attempt to drift over the Arctic Ocean, this time bringing on board a Curtiss plane named Christine to be used for observation flights over the ice. Filmmaker, pilot and scientist Odd Dahl joined the expedition and documented the wintering over and the first efforts to fly in the Arctic. But the plane crashed on just its second landing.
This is a beautiful small model of Maud made by one of the crew, Odd Dahl, who was very clever with building things. So it's very useful to look at the models when you're going to prepare for a lifting operation.
Although the scientific element of the expedition proved hugely successful, Maud failed to deliver the first crossing of the North Pole, despite spending 6 years in the ice floes. In 1925, the Maud and her crew were called back to Nome, Alaska, to meet Amundsen's creditors. The Maud was sold to the Hudson Bay Company to pay off the explorer's debts. Amundsen eventually made the polar crossing in the Norge airship, but disappeared a few years later while flying a rescue mission in the Arctic. His correspondence, skis, snowshoes and other remnants from his life on the Maud were preserved and today are on display here at the Fram Museum of Polar Exploration.
We have to remember that all through this time they did the scientific research. So that part of the expedition was successful, but that's not what reaches the public, because they want to know when Amundsen reached the North Pole. So in this way he had a problem with promoting the project towards the investors. So in this way the project was sort of double-sided.
The Hudson Bay Company renamed the ship Bay Maud and sailed her to Cambridge Bay, where she sank in shallow waters in 1930. Soon after sinking, Maud's top decks were plundered away for firewood and scrap by the Hudson Bay Company and needy locals, leaving only a row of ragged timbers sticking up out of the ice like the skeleton of a whale.
This was 1930. You know, the world was not prosperous. It was hard times, and to actually bring this ship back to Norway never became a realistic wish, even though the ship played an important role in the Norwegian polar research and the Norwegian history and the Amundsen story.
In 1991, the municipality of Asker, Norway, approached the Hudson Bay Company about purchasing the Maud, which was sold for $1 Canadian. But Asker never managed to bring the ship back. In autumn of 2010, the Tandberg brothers, 3 local developers, decided to save the Maud. A dream was born of repatriating the remains of the old polar ship and building a museum. The Tandbergs hired Jan, who had studied industrial design but had never done a ship salvage, much less a project this complex, with a shipwreck weighing several hundred tons deep in the frozen Northwest Passage. Naval architects and marine conservation specialists helped make structural calculations. Jan approached the salvage much like a polar expedition, with a settled crew that would follow the operation from beginning to end. Bjorn Miran is Jan's right-hand man, loyally by his side for more than 30 years.
Yeah, I know Jan for at least 45 years. And when this project came on, he asked me to follow him, because I always hanged around him, you know. And I might call me his left hand, because he is left-handed.
They work by the Norwegian method, says Bjorn. They talk. They take the time it takes. They troubleshoot problems on their own. Jan arrived in Cambridge Bay in the summer of 2011 and first approached the Inuit elders and locals about the old shipwreck. They welcomed the Norwegians with traditional singing and drumming. Then he and an underwater photographer took their first dive to survey the ship. Above water, the Maud looked in rough condition. But what Jan saw on his first dive beneath the frigid waters astonished him.
But when I went down under the water, it's very close to the shore. There was a wall, a massive wall meeting me. And you know, it's a big ship. It's at least for a human being to meet it, it's very big, and it was like a little bit scary, I must admit, the first times.
The main deck, the oak hull, everything that was below the waterline had been amazingly preserved.
And I had a knife, and I knocked the knife into the wood, and my knife bounced on the wood. You know, it was stone hard.
But he immediately noticed another environmental aspect that would haunt him the next 4 summers. A layer of extremely fine river delta silt that with just a wave of the hand would swirl up around the ship, blocking visibility for hours until it had settled again. That month, Jan investigated every corner of the wreck and deemed the oak still strong enough to handle a salvage operation and be sailed home.
And I started to swim around, and I could see that this ship looks like a ship that was actually could float. So straight away I had the feeling that this ship has been preserved by the nature over all these years. Even though the ice has torn and worn it, it was still in a very good condition.
The team flew back to Norway and immediately began planning. They reapplied for the Canadian permit, which was at first rejected by a committee who felt the wreck should remain in place. The Norwegians appealed, pleading with the Canadians to consider the Maud's importance for Norwegian and polar exploration history. They presented a detailed plan for financing, salvage, and eventual placement in a museum in Våland. They got the permit. It was clear the team would need to hire a barge and tug. Jan found a massive barge on sale online that had been intended for use on oil platforms. They bought it from Statoil and named it Jensen, after the man who built Maud. The barge would, however, need to be adapted in order to be able to carry the Maud. It was fitted with steel crossbeams in a shipyard before being sailed back to Våland, where more custom fittings would have to be made. Winter settled in at Munkesletten, and there was little work to be done. Jan returned to Cambridge Bay in December to see the moored in winter conditions. He took an enormous risk and dived under the ice to see how she was faring. Outside, it was -40. They drilled holes in the ice for lights.
There was a roof over us and we saw that the ship was framed in the ice and we had lights through the ice, so it was a beautiful view. And it was more like something I will carry with me. And also we could photograph the situation above the ice and give people an understanding of all the years that Maud has been laying there waiting for something to happen. I don't know.
Jan also visited the Carnegie Institute to do more research on Amundsen's story and the history of the Maud. In the spring, Stig Pettersen heard about the ambitious plan to raise and return the Maud using the retrofitted barge. A construction worker and son of a fisherman from Lofoten, Pettersen also had no ship salvage experience. But he could keep almost anything running. The beat-up Volvo station wagon he drives has 600,000 kilometers on the clock and has never been in a repair shop. He was passionate about polar exploration and desperately wanted to come on board the expedition.
I just asked him if he needed an extra man, and now he said he did not, but if I was interested I could come out here and visiting them. And he heard that I was from Lofoten, and he also has lived many years in Lofoten, so we kind of find the tone. And I came out here visiting them and helped them with the things on board.
The Tandbergs bought a splendid Norwegian farm complex on the beach at Munkesletten near Vålen and made it the headquarters for the Maud Returns Home expedition. They also bought an old used tug and named it Tandberg Polar. As preparations were underway, Stig showed up every day, fixing this on the tug or adjusting that on the barge. There was much to be done to prepare both vessels for the Atlantic crossing, with all the equipment on board that would be needed once in Cambridge Bay.
Like in the weekends I came out here and helped them, and also some evenings. And then it just became natural, and one day Jan asked me if I wanted to join them, and of course I wanted to join them.
By summer 2014, the expedition was ready to go. The team would take the Tandberg Polar, towing the Jensen barge, with balloons, generators, air compressors, and all the equipment necessary to save the Maud. On Midsummer's Night in 2014, the team set sail from Munkesletten, out from the Oslo fjord and the coast of Norway, headed across the Atlantic Ocean. After 10 days of smooth sailing, they hit a hurricane-force storm in the middle of the Atlantic.
Oh, it was pretty rough. And in the first, we didn't know the tugboat, so it was a bit scary the first 24 hours, just to know that the tugboat could take it. So, and it lasted for 3 or 4 days.
Walls of green water shook their tug, which rose and fell in the massive seas. The barge was battered and lost some of its load.
We had what's called green sea on the bridge. I guess it was maybe 5 times. And green sea then it's not good, because then the windows can break and then you are not comfortable if the sea breaks the windows. On the bridge, 10 meters over the surface.
After the storm, the crew assessed and repaired the damage. One of their best generators had been damaged, but both the tug and the barge had survived. In mid-July, the team passed Iceland and arrived in Nuuk, the capital of Greenland. There was still too much ice to pass through the Northwest Passage. They hunkered down for a month in Greenland, waiting for the ice breakup. On September the 7th, the Tandberg Polar and the Jensen arrived in Cambridge Bay. It was an enormous step forward, but ice would soon set in again. Jan flew a kite over the Maud to get a bird's-eye view. As the ice closed in around them, it became clear the lifting operation would have to be delayed for yet another summer. Jan flew the kite one last time over Maud, now frozen solid in the ice. On September the 27th, with snow and ice enveloping the bay, the team departed once again. Once the ice broke up around the Maud in the summer of 2015, the hard work on the lift could begin again. At the shore closest to Maud, the team created a base camp, equipped with an old green couch and the basic equipment needed for diving. Jan stayed in an apartment in Cambridge Bay, where he could sleep, eat, dry clothes, and prepare for the grueling schedule of 2 dives each day, one in the morning and one in the afternoon. Stig and Bjorn stayed on the Tandberg Polar, from which they would fish, giving them sustenance and something to trade with the locals. The technique the team planned to use was to take dozens of balloons out into the sea around Maud and fill them up with air so that they would lift the wreck from the sea floor. It was a tedious and tiring job. As the diver, Jan had the hardest job, working underwater in frigid temperatures to fix all the ropes and strap them around the Maud and connect the balloons onto her sides. Bjorn adjusted and fixed the hoses and took care of general logistics for the team, while Stig kept the engines, generators and compressors running on the tug. Jan had his hands full underwater, where the airbags proved difficult to manage. Balloons kept popping up to the surface. It was hard to know where to tie the ropes. There were air leaks that Jan had to fix while underwater. Silt was easily stirred up, delaying the work. But the biggest problem was simple physics. The Maud was waterlogged and heavier than they originally believed. The balloons did not seem to have enough lifting power to make her budge. The team was at a loss. They could not ship in additional balloons. But perhaps, they thought, they could make better use of what they had. They decided on a risky but innovative retrofitting solution. They would cut the balloons in half and use them vertically, like parachutes.
We started to cut one airbag in 2 and make this parachute, but we realized the same day that this was working extremely well, and then we could attach the airbags very close together, and we haven't seen these airbags being cut in 2 before, so we was a little bit curious if this was okay. But after a few days we had cut more and more, and at the end we had more than 20 or 25 of these parachutes, and each sort of underwater parachute is filled with air, and it lifts up maybe 3 to 4 tons of lifting power each bag.
Amazingly, the balloons in their upright position had more lifting power. Then, all of a sudden, Jan noticed something different. It was a turning point in their whole adventure.
Yeah, of course I'm up and down, and, but basically I have to attach everything down under the water. So we attached the front of the mod with the strapping system underneath, and we started to put pressure on her. And I saw that this doesn't look familiar. It was some new, my eyes saw something new. And I just realized it had come up like 30 centimeters, the whole keel. And I just then realized that the whole ship was actually lifting, which is a big moment, of course. But it was like, okay, now it's happened. And when I came up to the surface, I also understood that the other guys had seen it.
I guess I was in my very good sofa ashore, because I have a very good view from there. But when I realized it was racing, I went out to the tugboat, because I had promised the guy to jump into the sea if, when it raised. And it was a big moment, a really big moment. We have 4 years for it.
I was standing in the middle of the ship on the small raft, and just steering the airflow to the balloons. And yes, I could see it, because the ship was just a little underwater on just on both the port and starboard side. So when the wood came over the water, we know that it has happened.
They were able to tilt the ship into an upright position. It was the first major step toward a successful salvage. The tilt was key to helping determine Maud's exact weight, but there would not be enough time to carry out the full lift. They would need more balloons, which they had begun calling vertical parachutes, and these would need to be ordered specially. It would mean another delay of yet another year.
We had been there for a couple of months and working very hard, and realizing that we are not going to lift Maud this summer, but we have experienced what we need to know that it's going to happen.
That winter, the team of 3 met to go over every detail of their plan, troubleshooting what could go wrong and making sure they were prepared for every possible repair.
So, and the first summer was a very obvious trying and failing process. And you can say that, okay, maybe we should have understood more before, but it's so particular, this project, and the way Maud was positioned, and also the potential vulnerability of this ship. We feel good that we took the time to find out in detail how we should do it.
The team ordered more balloons and additional high-tech, super light and super strong rope from China. Down at the boathouse, the team also kept a 1:20 scale model of the Maud and barge, which they had built to test out in a variety of conditions. They would make little adaptations. Then Jan would kayak out into the frozen waters, trailing the barge and Maud behind, to see how she behaved in choppy seas.
And the parachutes, we call them parachutes later on, but they start as lifting bags. And we had the ropes, very strong ropes, from Hydema Spectra rope, which is as strong as wire, so but much lighter. These are very important elements. And then we have the air compressors in the ship, and also we have independent small compressors that can produce air, so we can fill the airbags and also fill the air tanks for my diving.
Concerned about the state of the tug and the need to have all the generators and compressors working properly, Stig and Jan went to Cambridge Bay a month ahead, along with trusted mechanic Han Terje, who works in the Lofoten shipyard.
I don't think you can have a better man for the purpose. So I have learned a lot. I'm really grateful to work with Terje. I learned very much.
To their dismay, after servicing, one of the generators refused to start.
You have a lot of pressure on you because it was 38 minus, and we could not be without power for a day. Then we will break a lot of the system on board. So even if it's not so very difficult, you feel that it's more difficult when you have to make it in short time. Otherwise, it have big consequences.
But the team was able to troubleshoot the generator repair and go back to Norway to wait for the ice breakup. Everything was ready to go.
Well, when we arrived in June 2016, we had the winter of relaxing and thinking about what we had experienced, and we felt good arriving in June and waiting for the ice to open. And around 1st of July in 2016, the ice opens around the Maud, and we could access for diving and also start the operation of continuing where we stopped last season.
The ropes had been laid beneath the Maud the summer before, and the balloons now had 150 to 200 tons of potential lifting power. All the balloons had to be refilled each morning, a process that took anywhere from 30 minutes to a few hours before Jan's dive would begin. It was a morning routine that involved checking and connecting the hoses, pumps, air compressors and multiple generators located on the barge, Tandberg Polar tug and smaller rafts being used in the operation.
We have 2 big tanks for starting air, and this is the one we are using for fill up all the balloons, and the compressor are big enough to keep up the air pressure even if we use air all the time. We never run out of air. Two compressors, yes, to load the start air. And then we have 2 generators, these 2 ones. And then we have, on the deck, we have 2 separate generators that we use for, in the winter we use one of them to heaten up the tug, to support the tug with the power. So one of these has actually been running for 2 years over the winter, keeping the boat warm in 50 minus.
6 cables connected the deck generators on the tug to the pumps on the barge. An additional small generator on the barge ran 2 very large pumps. Connecting all of this were 18 hoses carrying air to the balloons. The hoses could not get hung up on the boat. Losing a hose and risking the balloon filling with water was a risk they couldn't afford. There was no nearby mechanic or parts shop. Everything had to be repaired with what they had brought with them. Stig passed balloons to Jan and followed his position beneath the water from above the surface on a small raft, watching for the telltale bubbles that gave away Jan's position below, trying to guess what tool he might need, trying to anticipate any problems that could arise.
So sometimes he disappeared for me. And it's a little worrying because we have only one diver and you need to have control on where he is. Mostly I knew what he was going to do, so I knew where he was going to do work. And I tried to be there because it always happens something. He needs some ropes or air or anything.
Finally, after a week of preparations and adding balloons, the team could feel there was beginning to be some movement. Stig moved to the middle of the raft over the Maud to support Jan, who was swimming around the Maud, topping up all their balloons with as much air as they could take. It had to happen.
We had used all our buoyancy balloons, and we have not space to put any more, so it felt like it has to. And we, of course, we could feel that Maud was rolling from one side to the other. When we was putting air on one side, it moved over. So we could feel that it could not be so very far away, but we needed to have it from the seafloor, and so it's not enough to be close. So when it finally came up, it just felt unreal.
With her keel free, a whole new chapter of the Salvage could begin. Raising the Maud off the seafloor was the make or break moment of this salvage operation.
At the end of July, we had put more or less everything we had of airbags, and finally we had the lift of Maud. So the whole keel came free from the seabed, and Maud was floating in the surface. She didn't show anything of herself above the water, but she was free from the seabed, so we could move her around as we want. And that was extremely useful, because then we had phase one sort of done, and then we can move into phase two, and that involves the barge Jensen that we had brought from Norway, which is also going to be the one to be used for towing Maud back to Norway. And the barge was then, at the moment when we had Maud floating, the next day we started to sink the barge down to the seabed.
Freeing up the Maud from the seabed marked the end of phase one of the salvage. Phase two would be submerging the barge and maneuvering the Maud onto it in order to eventually lift her to the surface.
And so it was actually standing on the seabed, and we could, I guess this shows best. Here you see Jensen floats, and here she goes down to the seabed and lays on the seabed. And over the barge, between the barge and the surface of the water, there is space enough to maneuver Maud in a floating position, maneuver her over the barge, and then we can prepare for the lifting of the barge with Maud on top, which is a simple operation, technically, but still we hadn't seen it done before, so we were cautious about whatever could happen.
Lifting the Maud out of the sea, however, presented considerable risks, as no one really knew how solid her joints were, or where the actual center of gravity of the ship was.
But basically we just started to lift the front of the Jensen with the help of pumping the water out of the inside of Jensen. So in this way giving her more buoyancy. And then she started to push Maud out of the water, because Jensen has the potential buoyancy when she's empty from water to carry Maud in a floating position.
As the team lifted the front of the Jensen by pumping water out of its chambers, the Maud began to rise above the surface, to the delight of locals who began gathering at the shore to watch. However, Jan and his team had to keep the Jensen resting on the seabed to provide leverage and stability, as the more the Maud rose out of the water, the higher her center of gravity became, and with it, the risk she could topple off the barge. Once in the shallows, the team could raise the Maud out of the water and still have the barge under her resting on the seabed, to give stability, while they worked to free a century of debris from the wreck and stabilize it further. Then she could be raised fully out of the water.
If we lift Jensen up in the back part, it could be critical, because then we will risk that it could tip over, because the center of gravity is very high. So in this way, to avoid this risk, we reduced the weight of Jensen on the seabed by pumping water out. And then when she came close to being neutral, We had the opportunity to pull her slowly, but very close to the seabed, backwards into more shallow water.
Once the Maud was fully out of the water, the Tandberg brothers, who had sponsored the whole operation, arrived. The team hoisted the Maud's pennant. It was a triumph of tenacity and teamwork, a dream come true for the Tandbergs and the entire Maud Returns Home team, who had finally proven the naysayers wrong. It could be done. It had been done.
And this worked basically according to our plan, and it happened only in 1 week, 1.5 weeks, after months of fighting the airbag issue. We saw Maud coming up and show her beauty. And it was a happy moment for everybody. And when she was up in the floating position, we could put the old Maud flag up and have a little celebration.
Yeah, the boat is very spectacular. All the colors is the things that make most impression on me is the special color on the boat, inside the boat, everywhere it is this glowing. When the sun is shining on it, it's fantastic.
The Maud might have been raised, but the hard work was just beginning. She was full of debris, literally tons of mud and iron and steel. Amazingly, they found tools that had been used by Amundsen himself, even storage boxes with his name emblazoned on the side. Every foray into the Maud brought new surprises, and by watching the historical footage of the Maud expedition, they recognized objects that were being rediscovered a century later, still amazingly preserved, frozen in time by the sub-zero Arctic environment.
I'm very happy about that the Tandberg took the initiative to save the ship. They came when the boat was half up. So, and they were staying for 2 days, I think, 2-3 days. Oh, it was great. They were very enthusiastic, and also they worked a lot when they was helping, and they were not afraid to dig in the dirt and do a physical job on the project. That is also very nice.
In September 2016, the ice began to close in around the Maud once again, freezing her atop the barge for the winter. The team returned to Asker to plan for the final phase, towing the Maud slowly back to Norway via Russia.
Our hope is to be able to return to Norway the same way as Maud came, because Maud sailed this way to the Bering Strait before they wanted to do the drift over the North Pole. So it would be interesting for us to sail the same waters as Maud arrived.
Thanks to a group of hardy Norwegians who dared to dream, Maud may finally return home from the Arctic ice that never managed to destroy her. And this time, she's coming home for good. Winter storms in the Mediterranean Sea can be as dangerous as anywhere. The southwesterly gale-force winds wreck ships and run them aground regularly, and, sometimes notoriously, just a few meters from densely populated cities. The approach to the port of Livorno on Italy's western coast is among the most dangerous, shallow, narrow, and exposed. It was here that on the 13th of January 2017, the Liberian-flagged cargo ship Sigma ran aground, alarming the locals. On the 13th of January 2017, the cargo ship Sigma crashed onto the rocks outside the port of Livorno in Italy, at the mercy of the worst storms of the year. The massive orange vessel ran aground 5 years to the day since the wreck of the Costa Concordia on nearby Giglio Island.
For the time being, we attribute the cause of the wreck to the poor weather we've been having.
It reminds us, of course, of what happened on Giglio, which was a real tragedy. This is a funny incident. The crew is all well. The commander has not abandoned the ship.
The various Neri tugboats and the Coast Guard came, and they could do very little because there was a westerly wind that was really, really strong. The sea was really rough.
Livorno, on Italy's west coast, is one of the nation's most important ports. On Friday the 13th of January 2017, the sea was swept by a winter storm with southwesterly winds, a rare but dangerous event in the Mediterranean basin. The city of Livorno is home to the salvage and towage company Fratelli Neri, with over 100 years of experience in salvage, and, above all, the Mediterranean Sea's largest fleet of firefighting tugs, including the supply ship Nos Aries, that in early 2015 was involved in the recovery in the Pacific Ocean of the European Space Agency's IXV spaceplane. And, a few months later, refloated the Turkish ship Gökbel that sank close to the port of Ravenna. The Neri Salvage Company also assisted Dutch Smit Salvage in cutting up the Gelso M on the Sicilian coast near Syracuse. And exactly 5 years earlier, on the 13th of January 2012, they had begun debunkering the Costa Concordia. The 128-meter long and 13-meter wide Sigma is a general cargo ship registered in Liberia but actually owned by a Ukrainian company, Intresco. It weighs just over 10,000 tons. Not a very large ship by today's standards. The 80-kilometer-an-hour winds lashed the coast, whipping up massive waves. The wind penetrated the port and pushed a ferry off its moorings into the open entry channel. The Neri tugboats were already out early to bring her back to the quayside, when the Sigma also began dragging its anchor across the muddy sea floor and out of the shallow channel leading into the port. The Sigma was empty, light, and its propeller was out of the water. The Sigma's journey began here, in the Ukraine's Black Sea port of Odessa, where, until recently, the head of customs was the Euromaidan heroine Yulia Marushevska.
Odessa is a unique region for Ukraine, the biggest region with the 5 seaports. It's huge, full of people. It's the biggest exporter of grain, from agriculture to all these heavy industry products. That's something that are being exported the most.
With a war raging on the Ukraine's frontiers, every penny of foreign export is vital to the economy. Before resigning, Yulia Maruszewska implemented important reforms aimed at boosting trade to Western Europe, including Italy.
Yeah, that's a huge expensive goods that are an important part of our economy. I would say that today they are losing their positions that were like 2 or 3 years before, or even like in the Yanukovych time. Now grain, IT, medicine is getting even higher positions.
The Ukraine exports 29 million tons of grain annually, and all of it has to go through the Black Sea and the Bosphorus to get to the open Mediterranean. It travels on cargo ships just like the Sigma. The ship left Odessa in war-torn Ukraine for Venice. To make its long voyage to Italy, the ship passed through the Bosphorus and the Dardanelles, then into the open Aegean Sea. The winter storms were already brewing. By the time the ship reached Venice on the 7th of January, the southwesterly wind was already wreaking havoc with navigation. It was the same wind that, just a year earlier, had fanned the flames aboard the Greek ferry, the Norman Atlantic. In Venice, the ship offloaded the grain it was carrying from the Ukraine. It had encountered some problems, and the port authorities had not found it was fully compliant with international regulations. It sailed for Livorno to pick up Italian grain. The winter storms continued, the libeccio, as the Italians call it. It is a notoriously dangerous wind that blows from the southwest across the Mediterranean Sea from the Libyan desert, whipping up the waves. Initial reports suggest that the Sigma's captain attempted to move her bows into the wind, but caught a broadside wind and was unable to maneuver the ship. The orange monster headed for a beach and a small local swimming club, the Amici del Gabbiano, Friends of the Seagull, where a group of pensioners watched.
Livorno è particolare per i venti. Ora la dinamica sembra.
Livorno has a special wind condition. It seems that the ship carried out a mistaken maneuver and got broadside to the wind and got out of control, and the ship did what it did.
Now that the ship was on the rocks, the refloat would take 3 days' work. Livorno is one of Italy's largest container ports. It is a small city that survives on the work the port gives it. However, there are certain drawbacks. The channel into the port is shallow and narrow. The sea floor is a mix of mud, small rocks and pebbles, and it is difficult to map. Ships have to wait in a line outside the port before entering and swiftly loading or unloading their goods. The Sigma was anchored near the coast, waiting its turn to dock at port. It was high in the water as it was empty, stabilized by ballast water only, broadside to 80 km/h winds. And even if it had taken on seawater to give it ballast, it was high in the sea and light because it was empty. For reasons still unclear, the ship was blown off its anchorage as winds lashed at the side and swells continued to raise its propeller up out of the sea. The 18-member Ukrainian crew, led by Captain Nikola Staravoitov, 52, was worried the wind was dragging their anchor across the seabed and ever closer to shore. An investigation is underway to determine if they first reported their concerns to local authorities but help came too late, or if the Coast Guard contacted the ship concerned about its movements. Whichever the case, no one was able to brave the storm in time to stop the Sigma getting hung up on the rocky bottom of the city's waterfront, close to the iconic Gabbiano Bar. As the ship drifted towards the popular beach, the local population grew alarmed and called the Coast Guard and Fire Brigade. Eventually, the ship simply ran aground. With no immediate danger for the seaworthiness of the ship, port authorities agreed there was no need for an evacuation of the crew. In the meanwhile, the Neri tugs began preparing for the big pull. The Neri Salvage Company is more than a century old, and yet has the largest fleet of seagoing tugs and offshore supply vessels in the Mediterranean.
The main task of a tug is towing ships, controlling pollution and pumping water via pumps that are passed to the ships in difficulty that begin to pump water out of the ships, allowing them to float.
Corrado Neri is the great-grandson of the founder of the company, and the most powerful tug of the fleet carries his name.
Today our fleet contains 30 units that provide varying amounts of power, ranging between 30 horsepower up to 10,000 horsepower. And the tug we're on today represents a big step forward in technology in the area of oil platform and oil terminal support tugs.
The job of a tugboat is to tow and push large ships into their very tight berths on the quayside of the port. Livorno receives more than 60 ships every day, and cargo represents the livelihood of the city. The busy day of the 13th of January 2017 began with Neri tugs being called to push a ferry back to quayside, and ended with plans being made to remove the Sigma from the rocks. However, on a normal day, the Neri tugs work inside the port.
In the case of a ship in distress with a malfunctioning rudder or the main engine, these tugs can stop the ship or even make it change course, so as to avoid a collision with other ships, thanks to the special design of the hull.
The tugs may seem small, but they actually use their power in different ways from a cargo or passenger ship. Their engines are connected to propellers that can swivel through 360 degrees to provide pushing or pulling power in any direction instantly.
A cable, usually a steel cable, is passed over and, thanks to the power of the tugs activated through the azimuth propellers that can rotate through 360 degrees, the tug begins pulling and has great maneuverability provided by these propellers that allow it to move in every direction. So there is no longer the traditional rudder, but the propeller that moves the tug in every direction.
Here we see the Neri tugboats in action, accompanying a cargo ship through the narrow channel into the port of Livorno and pushing her against the quayside. A nylon rope is passed to the crew aboard, and then through the cable eyes, and then the cable itself is attached to the bollards on the ship. They are able to withstand the whole 110 metric tons of load that the tug produces. it is important that the cables stay taut for the whole pulling phase, as sudden excesses of load at single points can cause the cable to break. The high cabin of the tugboat offers excellent all-round visibility, and the delicate azimuth thruster controls give the tug captain total control of the ship.
The tugboat is small compared to the object it must tow, but it can carry out this task because although it is so small, it has an amazingly powerful engine, and above all, it's designed to apply pulling power. It's a bit like a tractor. It's not the speed that counts, but the pulling power.
However, on the morning of the 13th of January 2017, there was very little the Neri tugs could do, with the massive waves making even the tugboats unstable in the stormy sea. They could not approach the ship because of the shallow waters. The heroic attempts came to nothing as the day drew to a close. The team of experts responsible for removing the ship from the rocks withdrew to the harbour master's office, while a legal and technical team boarded the ship. While Salvage Masters discussed how to float the Sigma off the rocks, the authorities on land soon had a crowd management challenge on their hands. Traffic backed up along the route leading down to the beach as residents drove out to see the spectacle of the ship pulled right up to the city centre. The citizens of Livorno looked on and commented like the chorus in a Greek tragedy. The city lives off ships, but this one simply came a bit too close.
The reaction was one of surprise because seeing a ship come in so close doesn't happen every day. But then we got worried because the ship drew dangerously close. I repeat, it got as close as 20 meters. We saw the mariners on the bow of the ship who didn't look very happy.
As of Friday, we began to see the ship, and we began to see the first selfies, the social media, and everyone was broadcasting it in real time from here and there. There was a lot of curiosity because it was an extraordinary event.
It was a shocking sight, a steel monster that residents joked on social media should have been cited for driving into the city centre without a proper permit, or doing a sail-by of the downtown statue of Adonis. Joking aside, there was real concern about fuel leakage, since the Gabbiano beach is one of the most popular spots close to the city centre for residents to hit the beach, and just a stone's throw from the precious Tre Ponti area along Livorno's waterfront. A group of locals swim here every day.
It was a problem because it was physically dangerous to swim. First because, as you see, there were the Coast Guard and the Fire Brigade and the Labro Mare and the local police. All the possible authorities were out there. They railed off everything and made us go away. It's been 2 days that we haven't been able to swim. It attracts the tourists. Now they are all coming here and they will soon set up a bar. It's a kind of rather macabre tourism.
Pieno di gente.
There's a real crowd here. It's a rare event. We always hope that it never happens, but when it does happen, it's extraordinary.
Eclatante, no?
The ship was so far up the beach that Neri's heavy tugs could not approach. The complex layout of the sea floor with rocks, mud and pebbles could have trapped them too. So Neri used lighters to transport the Toscana tug's cable to the ship. Once they were ready for the tow, all they had to do was wait for the high tide that night, when the ship's ballast would be moved to lift the stern off the rocks. Meanwhile, the salvage team gathered in the harbour master's office to make a plan. As the sun set over the port of Livorno, the reflotation plan was prepared and the Neri tugs approached the orange cargo vessel to lift her off the rocks.
The weather conditions yesterday, when the incident occurred, were certainly absolutely prohibitive. We had southern westerly winds with bursts of very high winds, which pushed the ship and caused what we see. The bad weather caused what we see. Obviously, if there are individual responsibilities, these will be evaluated separately to see if these people are responsible.
First of all, the safety of the crew and the environment had to be ensured. Admiral De Marco was in charge.
As far as the weather is concerned, as you can see, the wind has changed and is coming from the land. The sea is still quite rough, but tomorrow it will be better. What we are interested in now is that the weather holds up long enough for us to move the ship.
The plan involved exploiting the high tide of 10 o'clock at night and pumping out the ship's ballast water to make her lighter and float higher in the sea, as the full power of the tugs was applied to the towing cables.
During the emergency, the people involved are the commander of the ship, certainly, the ship owner, then the technical register, under which the ship is classified, the harbor masters and the Coast Guard, both in managing the emergency and in the investigation, to the commander of the fire brigade and his men. I coordinate them as far as all the operations to be carried out are concerned.
The first operations of the fire brigade were to support the harbour master in the evaluation of the safety of the people aboard, and secondly, to verify the mechanical resistance of the ship. We participated in the technical analysis ordered by the harbour master.
Quindi abbiamo partecipato all'analisi e alle valutazioni fatte dalle componenti tecniche che hanno affiancato la capitaneria di porto. Abbiamo partecipato.
We examined the ship from on board. We prepared a rescue protocol for the crews should that have been necessary.
L'equipaggio nell'ipotesi che ce ne fosse stata la necessità.
The Neri tugs got to work and passed a cable to the stricken Sigma while the tide rose and the ballast was pumped from tank to tank and offloaded.
This ship was operating with the ballast tanks full, so we needed to lighten her. So part of this water, this ballast water, was emptied. It's just water, and another part is transferred into other ballast tanks so as to balance the ship differently, to lighten the stern, where it is assumed the ship is stuck, so that weighing the ship down on one side, lightening her on the other, and exploiting the tides, the ship comes up like a balloon, and it is removed.
The night drew out and the high tide came, but not everything went according to plan. The Neri tugs began applying their extreme pulling power.
The company, as far as I have seen, has 2 tugboats and 2 smaller boats. The Coast Guard is employing 2 other boats and a helicopter. The fire brigade, a boat with divers, a helicopter, and land-based vehicles. All the vehicles you can see. And then there's the Environment Protection Company that has all those small boats that have surrounded the ship with protection barriers to limit the area needed to be cleaned.
The activity aboard the tugs was frenetic as they applied full power from the engines to the cables.
Da qualche ora è in corso proprio l'operazione fisica del disincaglio.
For the last few hours, the actual refloating operation is underway. This involves essentially the lightening of the ship of the ballast water, waiting for the tide that is actually rising right now, attaching the ship to boats, that initially were used to keep her safe with respect to the coast where she ended up, and then using the same boats to transfer the ship off the rocks. All the double hulls of the ship are solid, as the Commission has determined. There has been no loss of fluids of any kind, fuel or anything else.
La Commissione così ha verificato, non ci sono state fuoriuscite di fluidi di nessun tipo, quindi di carburante e quant'altro.
As the night drew on, the Coast Guard Fire Brigade and salvers were ready to intervene as the tide and the ballast movement allowed tension to be applied to the cable.
If at this moment the ship were to begin to move and the ship were free of the rocks, as soon as it were under tow, it would be in Livorno port within 2 hours, including being berthed in the port, given the short distance from the port.
What the Admiral could not know was that the 700-meter-long cable, made of steel, would snap due to the sudden tensions that concentrated the massive weights involved at a single point.
It has stopped. It will take some time, I think.
The Sigma remained on the rocks, and once again, ballast water was pumped in to maintain stability during the night. In the world of ship salvage, having your tow line snap is one of the most dangerous things that can happen. Such an incident can result in injury or even be fatal. That was the case in the complicated salvage of the Norman Atlantic, when 2 Albanian mariners were killed when their tow line broke and whipped back to their boat. Here we see the tow line of the second Albanian tug dropped as the attempt was abandoned. In these incredible images from December 2015, mariners from the Italian Baretta company in Brindisi go aboard the abandoned and still smoking ship to pass cables to 2 tugboats in the open sea. The Italian salvors were successful, applying even force to the whole cable. The high winds continued to push the ship eastwards. It took 2 tugboats 2 days to pull her into port. The task of a tugboat is more than simply pulling ships to safety or through ports. Handling the weights and tensions on the cables takes expertise and experience. When the sun rose over Livorno, the storm had abated, but the Sigma was still stranded on the shallow rocks and mud of the Gabbiano beach. She had drifted 13 meters since she had run aground, showing that the hull was freer of the rocks and muddy bottom than previously anticipated.
Getting a ship off the rocks is a complex operation. It's not easy, and there's always an unexpected problem round the corner. Yesterday there was a need to change a cable, so this morning's operations were stopped.
Now that the sea was calm, the divers could at last inspect the hull of the ship.
The use of divers is explained very simply. Yesterday, with a southwesterly wind, inspecting the outside of the hull underwater was impossible. But today the conditions are much more favourable, so we are able to use the divers to inspect the hull, to check for damage that did not appear during the internal inspection, so we can now check externally too.
Meanwhile, back at the Harbour Master's office, the team of salvors and Coast Guard officers made a new plan. Above all, the safety of the crew and the environment had to be ensured. The Environment Protection Team of Labromar was called in.
A seguito della richiesta dell'autorità marittima abbiamo dovuto mettere in campo tutto uno spiegamento di forze.
At the request of the port authorities, we made available a number of units for the prevention of pollution and prepared to do everything necessary to clean up any oil spills.
Avevamo 2 battelli a mare, un battello antinquinamento munito di 300 metri di panne galleggianti.
We had 2 ships out at sea with 200 meters of floating barriers that, if necessary, would have surrounded the ship and controlled any pollution.
Circondare la nave con queste panne e quindi contenere l'inquinante.
The Ministry of the Environment was testing the waters for potential pollution in real time, and the local prosecutor's office had opened an investigation into how the grounding happened.
For the time being, we attribute the incident to the bad weather that we've been having. Any other responsibilities will be evaluated on the basis of elements collected over time during the investigation. The helicopter was deployed and placed on standby just in case there was any need to intervene, and the divers did not operate underwater but as rescuers on the surface, just in case somebody who had gone aboard had been in difficulty. So they were there in a safety function to prevent any problematic situations.
Avesse avuto delle difficoltà, quindi era una cornice di sicurezza che cercava di prevenire danni in situazioni potenzialmente critiche che si potevano verificare.
Fire brigade helicopters flew overhead just in case someone needed rescuing. Aboard were their rescue divers. The fire brigade also made its land-based equipment available. The sea was calm and the wind had changed direction.
È un po' più forte di ieri. Questo vento ci aiuta sicuramente a tenere.
The wind is a little stronger than yesterday, and that helps us if it keeps the sea a little calmer. But should the wind get stronger, it certainly won't help the operations. But as it stands, the weather conditions are favorable. That I can say.
Sono delle condizioni di tempo abbastanza favorevoli, ecco, questo posso dire questo.
By late morning, the plan was approved, and it was decided the towing would go ahead that night. A Coast Guard dinghy carried the tow line from the ship to a Neri tugboat in the deeper channel outside the port. The 700-metre cable weighed 25 metric tons so as to avoid it breaking again. The tugs themselves were not able to draw closer to the ship because the sea was too shallow even for them. While the ballast water in the ship's tanks was offloaded to allow her to rise off the rocky bottom, Neri deployed 3 massive buoys to hold the cable off the sea floor where it might snag on the rocks where it had stuck the night before. Now the salvage team was ready for action as soon as the tide turned.
The moment they thought they could begin the operation, a cable broke, and well, everything had to start over. And now they are reorganizing everything. It's not that simple. It's not as though you go and get a new cable and just put it on, you know. We believe they now need just as much time again to reorganize.
Pensiamo che ci sia altrettanto tempo a disposizione per riorganizzare.
In questo momento questo cavo è nella fase di sostituzione, è un cavo d'acciaio.
They are in the process of replacing the cable. It's a steel cable, and as you can see, there are buoys holding it in place. Once it has been attached to the ship will be emptied of its ballast once again, because last night it was filled with ballast to give it weight, to keep it secure, because it had to remain where it was.
Per riavere nuovamente il suo peso per poter rimanere in sicurezza.
The ship had not had an easy journey from the Ukraine. Already in Venice it had been stopped in port as maritime authorities carried out inspections, noting a number of health and safety violations. These violations were serious enough for the ship to be detained for 5 days, from the 3rd to the 7th of January. Coast Guard authorities in Venice in fact found 10 areas deficient, including improper use of the rescue radio, poor food conservation, bad maintenance of fire doors and the fire extinguishing system, poor work conditions, including a lack of first aid and medicine on board. The inspections also found problems with the auxiliary motor. But despite all these issues, the Sigma was allowed to sail clear around the boot of Italy, on to Livorno. Coast Guard authorities and prosecutors were puzzled by the route shown by the Automatic Identification Signal, or AIS, sent by the ship, which showed a very odd zigzag movement. Authorities also confiscated logbooks, manifests and other materials from inside the ship and questioned the captain. The port city of Livorno lives off the high volume of maritime traffic. Over 7,000 vessels pass through the port, loading and offloading more than 29 million tons of cargo. The Sigma was at anchor in the approach channel to the port, which is narrow and shallow. Hundreds of ships queue up here before entering the port.
Livorno
has always based its quote-unquote fortune, its economy, on the port. The port of Livorno is attached to the city and to the whole economy that revolves around the city. If the port works, the city works. If the port is not doing well, then Livorno won't do well. Luckily, the port of Livorno, with its ups and downs, has a heavy trade, as you can see from the ships in the queue, waiting to load and unload, and so thank goodness Livorno has its port.
Ebbene sì, Livorno è il suo porto.
On Sunday the 15th of January, the sea was calmer and the sky promised fine weather. The local population had come to see how the next attempt to tug the ship off the rocks would go.
Molte ipotizzavano come si poteva togliere.
A lot of people were debating how they would have removed the ship. Oh, I would have done this. Because, of course, we are always ready to try to come up with an improvised solution. I would have pulled it from behind. I would have used a helicopter. So there were a whole bunch of situations that were funny and strange. Yesterday, someone said, oh, the cables were rusty and would certainly break. And that's actually what happened. So then, that was sort of a prophecy.
Questa è stata un po' una profezia.
Niente, è ferma. Oh, l'importante.
So that's it. It's stuck there. The important thing is that no one got hurt, and it didn't lose any fuel that could have polluted.
Il gasolio per inquinare.
The timing of the operation had to be precise. The added complication was that this would have to be done at night. Once the tow lines were attached, the ship and tug tandem had to wait for the highest possible tide when the water in the bay was at its daily high. The Sigma had to swiftly de-ballast, which means the water in its bilge tanks would have to be removed to make the ship lighter, float slightly higher. The tug had to ensure that there would be no resistance from the ship when she began pulling. As the night drew on, the media and authorities gathered on the jetty and the beach. This time, not only the Coast Guard officers watched anxiously, but also the directors of Neri Salvage, Pietro and Corrado Neri. The 700-meter cable began taking the strain, applying the 110-ton pulling power while it was kept off the sea floor by the three boys. Slowly, under the cover of darkness, the Sigma general cargo ship began to move. Its 10,000 metric tons were lifted by the tide, and as the ballast water was moved to the forward bilge tanks, the stern was levered off the rocks. The Sigma disappeared from view into the deeper channel, ready to be towed into port. The port of Livorno is a big employer and moves 32 million tons of goods every year in and out. Most of the goods come in 399,000 containers. However, the port is also able to handle fluids such as oil and free-flowing solids such as grain and timber. As Livorno is also a ferry port, it also handles nearly 200,000 vehicles every year going to Italy's islands and North Africa. The Sigma had carried Ukrainian grain to Venice, but was picking up Italian grain from Livorno. Now she was safely berthed alongside the quay. The investigation into why she ran aground could get underway. The crew was relieved, but were not allowed off the ship. Later, she could be loaded with her cargo and take to sea once more. The regulars who hang out at the city of Livorno's swimming club, the Gabbiano, or Seagull, could breathe a sigh of relief and get back to their regular routines. On the club's walls hangs a picture of another wreck that happened in exactly the same place.
In
1925, obviously none of us were here at the time, but our grandparents told us the story of this merchant ship that ran aground right here on this beach. And it was stuck there quite a while, so it's not really surprising to see a ship running aground here. It happened nearly 100 years ago.
The port could get back to work, the excitement over, as cargo ships once again queued up outside the port to offload or load up their goods. For the people of Livorno, this represents their living. Without the ships, and even the dangers they sometimes represent, the city would be nothing.
Thank God for the maritime traffic. The more ships that go in and out of this port, the more trade there is, and the more business there is, and the more Livorno prospers.
Livorno, once the great port of Tuscany, is still home to the Mediterranean Sea's largest fleet of tugs and salvage vessels. Its fortunes are tied to the sea, even when the tide of the sea turns against it.